Chapter 13. The Four Champions. As if in slow motion, Violet turned her head toward the Gryffindor table across the hall and found her brother in the crowd. Harry sat there, face upturned toward the high table, mouth agape. There was no applause. A buzzing, as though of angry bees, was starting to fill the hall. Some students were standing up to get a better look at Harry where he sat, frozen in his seat. Up at the high table, Professor McGonagall had got to her feet and swept past Ludo Bagman and Professor Karkaroff to whisper urgently to Professor Dumbledore, who bent his ear toward her, frowning slightly. Across the hall, Harry turned to look in Violet's direction. They locked eyes, and ever so slightly, Harry shook his head. He didn't do it, Violet breathed, staring even as her brother turned to his friends, all wearing their own dumbstruck expression. He doesn't know what's going on. Tracy didn't answer. She too was staring blankly at Harry. At the high table, Professor Dumbledore had straightened up, nodding to Professor McGonagall. "Harry Potter," he called again. "Harry, up here if you please." Harry rose uncertainly to his feet, trod on the hem of his robes, and stumbled slightly. Violet's eyes were on him the entire way as he set off up the gap between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables, as were the hundreds and hundreds eyes of the rest of the school. The buzzing grew louder and louder, though Violet couldn't make anything out over the pounding of her heart. Dumbledore wasn't smiling when Harry reached him. None of the teachers were. Professor McGonagall was wringing her hands in front of her, and Professor Lupin, looking very pale and peaked the day after the full moon, was watching Harry just as intently as Violet herself. Even Hagrid, who sat right at the end of the teacher's table, did not wink or wave or give any of his usual signs of greeting as Harry passed him. Harry passed through the door and out of sight, and all hell broke loose in the great hall. How did he get his name in? He's too young. There's no way they'll let him compete. Little cheat. Does this mean we get we're champions? How's that work? The swirl of comments and speculations that burst from all around was silenced with some difficulty by Professor Dumbledore, holding both hands in the air and calling for quiet. "If I could have your attention for a moment longer," Dumbledore said loudly, quelling the last of the buzzing. "The championship ceremony has been concluded. I offer warm thanks and appreciation to our guests, Mr. Crouch and Mr. Bagman, who will be of great further aid in working out the details of this extraordinary occurrence. Though I know it will be difficult to sleep after so much excitement, you are all encouraged to find whatever rest you may in anticipation of the surprises to come. A very good night to you all." And with that dismissal, Dumbledore turned and immediately headed for the door Harry had just vanished through, flanked by Mr. Crouch, Mr. Bagman, and Professors McGonagall and Snape. The buzzing started up again. The prefects desperately tried to get everyone into orderly lines out of the hall and back to their common rooms while also taking part in the discussion. Violet broke from the crowd immediately. Fighting against the tide of bodies, she pushed her way to the high table and ran up to Professor Lupin. "What's going to happen to Harry?" she demanded, startling him. He'd been staring toward the door with a worried expression on his pale face. "I am afraid I don't know," Lupin said, leaning down to speak to her. "Professor Dumbledore will sort this all out, Violet, I'm sure." "But what if he doesn't?" Violet pressed, confusion now veering dangerously toward panic. "Last night he was talking about binding contracts and magical obligations, and about how dangerous the tournament is supposed to be. They can't make Harry compete, can they?" Lupin was doing an impressive imitation of Professor McGonagall now, with his mouth pressed into a thin, worried line. He glanced again toward the door Dumbledore and the champions had disappeared through. "We'll just have to see what happens," said Professor Lupin quietly. "I'll see if I can't speak to Harry on his way out." He looked back to Violet and flashed a nervous smile. "You should go along with the rest of your house, Violet. I'm sure there will be plenty of excitement in the dungeons tonight over Cassius being chosen." Tracy was waiting for her at the top of the stairs, leading down into the Slytherin dungeons. "What's going on?" she hissed, latching onto Violet's arm as soon as she came in range. Did you talk to Cass or to Harry? Are they going to make one of them step down? I don't know, Violet said, as the two of them headed down toward the common room. I only got to speak with Professor Lupin, and he doesn't know what's going on either. But I can't imagine they'd let Harry compete. I should hope not since he only got in by cheating. What are you talking about? Violet said, frowning. Harry's not a cheater. Tracy rolled her eyes. Roman 6. Really, how else could he have even gotten his name into the goblet in the first place? He's not old enough. He must have cheated somehow. Harry doesn't cheat, Violet bristled, but by then they had reached the blank stretch of stone wall that served as the entrance into the Slytherin common room. Tracy spoke the password, the stretch of wall slid open, and the two girls stepped inside. There was an immediate uproar. "Where is he?" demanded a squat seventh-year girl, craning to look behind Violet and Tracy. "Where's Warrington?" "Not with us," said Tracy hotly. "I expect he's still with the other champions." "The other real champions," said Graham Montague, a burly boy in same year as Cass. He sneered disdainfully at Violet. "What does your brother think he's playing at, Potter?" The little cheat's got no chance. Violet's face went flush with embarrassment and anger. "Harry's not a cheat," she said boldly. A few people scoffed and rolled their eyes at her, but it was the cold voice cutting through the crowd that really set a fire in Violet's belly. "It's always something with the two of you, isn't it, Potter?" said Draco Malfoy loudly. The gathering of Slytherins parted to reveal him in his usual spot in front of the fire, leaning against the arm of the sofa where Crabbe and Goyle sat. His grey eyes were twin chips of ice set in his pale, pointed face. "It's like you can't help yourselves, always having to be the center of attention. What's the matter? Don't get enough of it at home?" A few oaths went up around the room. Tracy took a step toward Malfoy, but Violet caught her arm and held her back. "At least I can get attention without having to write home and beg for it," Violet countered. "Don't you think your father gets tired, having your owl pestering him with your problems every other day?" The oaths were louder this time, and accompanied by a loud snort of laughter from the back of the room. Malfoy's face went a livid shade of pink. "You don't know anything about my father," he spat, "much less what we talk about. Not that you would, seeing as you haven't Catone." "All right, enough," called a firm female voice, and the sixth-year prefect, Zoe Crington, stepped into the middle of the room. "Malfoy, Potter, you're both out of bounds. Can we have just 5 minutes of house unity, please? One of ours was just named school champion." The room burst into cheers of excitement once more, while Violet and Malfoy seethed at one another. Crabbe and Goyle stood to close ranks around Malfoy, cracking their knuckles threateningly. But even their massive forms were soon swallowed by the cheering, jumping crowd of Slytherins of all years. Tracy joined arms with Violet and bodily tugged her off to the side of the common room. "I'll get him for you," she muttered into Violet's ear over the din of the crowd. "Just say the word, Roman 6, and I'll chuck a curse right at his evil little ferret face and put him in the hospital wing for a month. He's just jealous because he couldn't figure out how to slip his name into the goblet like Harry did." "I don't think Harry did put his name in the goblet," Violet said once they were tucked out of the way. "What are you talking about?" said Tracy incredulously. "Didn't you see his face when Dumbledore called on him?" said Violet. "He looked terrified besides. He would have told me if he'd gone and done something like that. I'm sure of it." But Violet wasn't entirely sure of that at all, actually. If Harry thought she might try to stop him, or even get him in trouble for trying to put himself in danger. Some of the doubt must have shown on her face, because Tracy was looking very doubtful as well. "I know the two of you are close, but I don't think you can expect Harry to share everything he does with you. Do you tell him about everything that you've done?" The yes that Violet wanted to bite back with got stuck behind her teeth. It was a lie. She was keeping a laundry list of secrets from her brother, not least the fact that she had gone back in time at the end of last year and stopped him from being bitten by a werewolf and being kissed by dementors. But most of the things she kept from him were problems or fears, things that she didn't need to worry anyone else with, not accomplishments. Harry wasn't known for bragging, but he did like to share his excitement about things, unless he wanted to surprise her. But then Ron and Hermione had looked just as stunned as Violet when Harry's name was called. Wouldn't he have told them, at the very least? Violet didn't have any more time to descend into a spiral of doubt and anxiety, because at that moment the door to the common room opened once more and Cass ducked his head inside. The sheer wall of noise that greeted him caused him to take a step back in shock. As one, the students in the common room rushed him with arms extended, all reaching to shake his hand and pat his back and clap him in the shoulder in congratulations. Cass was swallowed up in the crowd. "There's our champion," shouted Derek, one of the beaters on the Slytherin Quidditch team. He grabbed Cassius by the wrist and hoisted his arm high into the air. A fresh cheer exploded out of the crowd. From where she stood, Violet could just see Cass's flushed, grinning face through the sea of heads and shoulders. "Let me through," Tracy said, trying to shove her way to the front of the common room. "He's my friend Hay." Despite her protests, Tracy rebounded off the wall of bodies without making any progress. She stood next to Violet and pouted. "No fair, hogging him. He'll never hear us if we try to congratulate him through all of this." "I want to know what's happening with Harry," Violet said anxiously. Tracy rolled her eyes. "Harry's fine, Roman 6, she said. "I know you're happy for your brother, but can't somebody else have a moment of excitement for once?" "I'm not happy for Harry, I'm worried about him," Violet protested, nettled by Tracy's words. "Cass can have as much excitement as he wants. I just want to know." Another particularly loud cheer went up, and the next moment Cassius was lifted bodily into the air, held up on the shoulders of two seventh-years boys. Tracy shrieked with laughter and joined in the clapping. Violet alone didn't seem to be in the mood to celebrate. After a moment's consideration, she turned on her heel and headed down into the girls' dormitory. Even with the door firmly shut behind her, she could still hear the loud chattering coming from the common room. She pulled the pillow over her head and rolled away from the door. The next morning, Violet woke early and dressed in a hurry before any of the other girls were even awake. The hangings around Tracy's bed were pulled open on the side facing Violet's bed, leaving a slit just wide enough to see her sleeping, peaceful face. Violet pointedly avoided looking at Tracy. She was still nettled by her remarks from the night before and hadn't decided on what, if anything, she wanted to say about it just yet. Slipping out into the stairwell, Violet was surprised to hear voices coming from the common room. Most people didn't get up at this hour, much less after a full feast and such a night of excitement. She crept quietly up the stairs and peeked out into the common room. Cass was sitting on the sofa by the fire, Malfoy's usual spot, and was surrounded by a small group of first and second years, bright eyes full of awe and admiration, leaning so far on the edge of their seats that some of them looked likely to slide right off of them. "Big responsibility, isn't it?" a boy was saying. Violet recognized him from the sorting at the beginning of the year, but couldn't remember his name. "Being chosen to represent us Slytherins, not just us," chimed in a second-year girl. "He's going to be representing Galaf Hogwarts in the tournament. It's Agrathana," she said in such a serious, reverent tone that Violet was forcibly reminded of Percy. "Are you nervous?" asked the boy, only for another first year to scoff at him. "Course he's not nervous, Malcolm, he's a champion." "Champions aren't scared of anything." "Well, I don't know about that," Cassius muttered, smiling nervously. He looked surprisingly at ease being surrounded by so many children. "I'm scared of loads of things." "Like what?" said the Percy girl, sounding shocked. Cass raised a hand and started counting on his fingers. "Vampires, dragons, skeletons, Professor McGonagall, Filch on a bad day, Filch on any day, really tight spaces, drowning, being on fire, the dark, snakes." "Snakes," exclaimed a first-year girl. "How can you be a Slytherin if you're scared of snakes?" "They don't bother me on tapestries and paintings and the like, just the real ones. Have you ever seen a real snake?" "No," said the girl, with a stubborn set to her jaw. "But I don't think I'd be scared if I did see one." "Not even if it surprised you," said Cass, his voice dropping playfully as he leaned forward in his seat. Not even if you were sitting there, minding your own business when all of a sudden, a snake came slithering along. And get you. Quick as a flash, his arm streaked out into the girl's belly, tickling her. Half the kids shrieked, while the others broke out into uproarious laughter, and Violet didn't even realize she was laughing too, until Cass turned in his seat and looked right at her. A wide smile and a bright blush spread across his face at the same time. Hi, Roman 6, he stammered. How long have you been standing there? I haven't, Violet lied quickly, her face going flushed as well. I just got here. One of the first-year boys gasped loudly. You're Violet Potter, he said, pointing. His wide eyes swiveled back to Cass. You know her. Most people do, Cass said airily. She's quite famous, you know. Is she your girlfriend? Asked one of the second-year girls. Cass and Violet both said, no, very loudly, and then looked at one another. Cass's face had gone pink again. He got abruptly to his feet. I bet the Great Hall will be a madhouse today, he said, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his trousers. I think I'll head down before it gets too crowded, get myself a seat. Fancy a walk, Roman 6. Violet, who was now being eyed suspiciously by all the young girls in front of the hearth, nodded automatically. Why, yeah, she stammered. Sure, I love walking. Violet's face was scarlet as she followed Cass out of the common room doorway. Glancing back, she saw that two of the girls were now whispering to each other behind their hands and giggling. She quickly looked away again and was very grateful when the wooden door clicked shut behind her, followed by the stone wall sliding into place. Suddenly it was very silent. Now that they were away from the glow of the fireplace, it was also very cold. Violet tucked her hands into her sleeves and shivered. Shall we? Cass said, gesturing up the hallway. Violet nodded wordlessly, and then they were off. The entrance hall was mostly deserted at this hour, save for a couple of ghosts who looked to be arguing with a portrait. With the goblet of fire no longer sitting in the middle of the floor, there was no reason for anyone to be up and loitering about this early. The ghosts paid them no mind as they passed, footsteps echoing softly off the flagstones. Violet wasn't sure where they were heading, but she followed all the same, trying to keep up with Cass's long-legged stride as he took the staircase 2 steps at a time. Their fight from the day before was still fresh in Violet's mind. She was hurt, and she wanted to be angry, and she wasn't sure whether or not Cassius even wanted to speak to her, or if he only wanted to get away from the kids in the common room, and she provided a convenient excuse. Neither of them spoke until they'd reached the second-floor landing. I didn't see you in the common room last night, Cass said conversationally, after the announcements. Tracy said you went to bed. Yeah, said Violet. I was tired. I thought you would have wanted to hear what the teachers told us and what happened with Harry. Is he all right? She asked at once, forgetting her nerves. They're not really going to make him compete, are they? Well, actually they are, Cass said, a deep frown settling onto his face. We all thought there had been a mistake when they told us. Mr. Bagman introduced him as the 4th champion, and then all the teachers stormed in, arguing about how unfair it was for Hogwarts to have it with champions. What did Harry say? That he didn't put his name in the goblet, and he didn't have anyone do it for him. Dumbledore believed him, and McGonagall stood by Dumbledore, but the other headmasters were ready to riot before Mad-Eye stepped in. Cass lowered his voice into a passable impression of Professor Moody and said, They've all got to compete. Binding magical contract. Powerful magic at work to bamboozle the goblet like that. He reckons somebody jinxed the goblet of fire, Violet asked in disbelief. But why? Cass went quiet. The two of them passed the 3rd-floor landing, still heading upward. I don't want you to worry, he said quietly, glancing sidelong at Violet, but I know you will anyways, so I suppose I might as well tell you the truth. I don't know if Harry will. Harry doesn't lie to me, Violet said at once, but Cass shook his head. I know, but he mightn't tell you some things, just like you do with me and Tracy if you think it'll upset us. And what Moody said was pretty upsetting, actually. Violet's ears were already ringing. Cass, tell me, she demanded. Tell me what he said. Promise me you won't start crying. I can absolutely not guarantee that, and you know it. Fair enough, he smirked, but the expression faded quickly back into a worried sort of frown as they climbed the next set of steps. All right, well, Moody definitely thinks somebody cursed the goblet into thinking there were 4 schools entering instead of 3, to make sure Harry's name would have to be chosen, and that he'd a veto compete. Nobody knows who or how they did it, but Moody thinks whoever did it was trying to put Harry in danger. He said they might even hope he'll die in the tournament. Violet's stomach lurched. But that's got to be rubbish, she said, a touch of desperation creeping into her voice. Mad Eye's not, I mean, the way people talk about him. He sees danger everywhere, doesn't he? Cass let out a snort of laughter. Funny, that's exactly what Karkaroff said. He spat the name like a curse. For a moment, it looked as though he actually meant to spit it out of his mouth and onto the flagstones, but decided against it. What about Dumbledore? Violet pressed. Did he believe Moody? He didn't agree or disagree with him, just said that we've got to deal with the situation, and both me and Harry had to compete. The other headmasters were livid, but with the magically binding contract, and I don't think there's anything they could do about it. Bagman was the only one excited about the whole thing. So what exactly are they expecting you to do? Asked Violet, suddenly aware of just how many questions she was peppering him with. For the tasks, I mean. Did they tell you? Cass sighed heavily. Only that there's going to be 3 of them, and we're not allowed to ask for help. The first one starts at the end of November, and not allowed to ask for help, Violet exclaimed, stunned. But of course you'll need to ask for help. What if you don't know what's going on, or don't understand the rules, or it's bollocks, I know, Cassius said. But they were really clear about that part at least. The first task is going to be a surprise, apparently. To see how we cope with danger and test our courage, or some nonsense like that. Here, let's have a seat. Violet hadn't been paying attention to where they were walking, so caught up was she in the stress of their conversation. She looked around with a start and realized they were all on the other side of the castle, having gone up one staircase and come down the other. They were back on the 2nd floor. What are we doing here? She asked. I thought you were taking me somewhere. Just for a walk, Cass said, settling down on the wooden bench and motioning for Violet to join him. Mostly, I wanted to get out of the common room before everybody else got up. Last night was madness, I thought. They'd never let me get to bed. Try as she might to drown it out, Violet had been well aware of the celebration raging in the common room until all hours of the morning. Slytherin House was taking its champion very seriously. She could only imagine what effect this whole thing would have on the already vicious rivalry with Gryffindor. I need to ask you a favor, Violet said suddenly, at the same time that Cassius said, I need to tell you about something. Oh, sorry, said Violet. You go ahead, you first, Cass said with a courteous little nod of his head. I insist. Oh, Violet's cheeks flushed pink. Well, like I said, I need a favor. Name it, Cass said at once. I need you to look after Harry. Oh, he said, blinking. Wait, what? In the tournament, she pressed. He's going to need all the help he can get, and you're the only one I can trust to look out for him. I think your brother's more than capable of looking out for himself, Romans 6, said Cass, a little stiffly. He's managed to get this far. I know, but this is different. This is a competition. It's not something he can just run away from or duel his way out of. They made the rule that no one under 17 could enter for a reason we're not strong enough to face whatever they're going to pit you against. Violet, you're the most powerful witch I know, Cass said flatly, and Harry's the same age as you. The 2 of you are far from helpless. That's thank you, I mean, but Violet was blushing again, harder than before, and she had to pause for a moment to get her thoughts back together. Look, I'm not asking you to babysit Harry, that's my job. But can you at least? I dunno, go easy on him, Cassius' eyebrows shot up. Go easy on him. You want me to let him beat me at the challenges? Notal off them, Violet said, but the look on Cass's face made her regret it. And no, okay, you don't have to let him win, Cass, all right. But can you at least promise me you won't hurt him? or let him get hurt. The other champions are sure to try and take him out, and if I can't be there to have his back, Merlin's arse, Violet, it's not a fight to the death, Cass said in exasperation. But it could be. People haved it in this tournament. Dumbledore said so when they first announced it. And you just told me he thinks someone might be trying to kill Harry. No, I said Mad I thinks someone is trying to kill Harry, and Mad I thinks everyone is out to kill each other because he's a nutter. Somebody put Harry's name into the goblet, and it wasn't Harry, Violet said firmly. He's being targeted. People have been trying to kill him since he was a baby, and they haven't stopped since, even if Voldemort is dead and gone forever. Cass flinched fiercely at the name, but Violet didn't apologize. They're still coming after us. All I'm asking is for someone else to have his back for once. Cass did not look happy. His brow was deeply furrowed, and there was an unpleasant frown pulling down the corners of his mouth, but at least he looked to be thinking about what she'd said. Violet didn't think she was being unreasonable at all, but apparently she had crossed some sort of line. I can't promise to let him win, Cass said eventually, and Violet's heart leapt. But if it comes down to it, I might take a hit for him once in a while. Keep the others off his back, I suppose. That's all I'm asking, Violet said quickly. I don't want you to get hurt either, and I don't expect you to give up your shot at winning. Just keep an eye out for him. That'll be enough. Fine, I will keep an eye on Harry for you. I promise. Violet heaved a sigh of relief. Thank you, Cassius, she said earnestly. I know you think I worry too much, and maybe I do, but he's the only family I have. And after what happened at the World Cup with the Death Eaters marching and not knowing where Pettigrew is, everything is just a little scary right now. Violet reached out and placed her hand on Cass's arm, giving it a gentle squeeze. But I really appreciate you putting up with me and saying you'll help. It means a lot. Cassius was staring into his lap, where Vile's fingers rested on his wrist. It might have been her imagination, but he looked a bit more pink than before. Violet pulled her hand away and said, All right, your turn. He looked up her, blinking slowly. You let me go first, so now it's your turn. When his muddled expression went unchanged, she added, You said you had something to tell me. Yeah, Cass straightened up and ran his fingers nervously through his hair. Right, actually, never mind that. It's not important. Are you sure? It sounded like it might be. Cass shook his head. Nah, not really. It's almost time for breakfast anyways. Shall we head back? The great hall was just starting to fill up when the two of them wandered in. A round of cheers went up from the Slytherin table as Cass walked by, making him flush and duck his head. In their usual spot, Tracy was already waiting. There you two are, she exclaimed as they took their seats. Where have you been? I got worried when I woke up and saw you'd gone, Violet. Sorry, Violet said quickly, abashed. I went to bed early, so I couldn't sleep. Me either, Cass said. We just went for a walk. Tracy's eyebrows shot up. What, the both of you? She said, looking between Cass and Violet. Together, yes. And without me. You were asleep, Violet said a bit awkwardly. It was really early, Tracy. I suppose it must have been, Tracy replied. It was obvious that she was miffed, but pretty soon they were chatting normally over breakfast, waiting for the rest of the school to trickle in. Every time the doors of the great hall opened, Violet looked up expecting to see her brother, but Harry never showed for breakfast, or for any meal after that. She saw no sign of him as she spent the day wandering the halls with her friends. It was as though he were in hiding, and there was no small question as to why. Everywhere they went, people stopped them to congratulate Cass and ask him how it felt to be chosen as Hogwarts true champion. He would flush and try to stammer out that he wasn't the true anything, but nobody wanted to hear it. When Violet was recognized, all she was met with was cold stares and derisive comments. In near tears by the end of the day, Violet almost wished she'd stayed in bed. If she thought that matters would improve once everyone got used to the idea of Harry being champion, the following day proved just how wrong she was. Harry could no longer avoid the rest of the school once they were back at lessons, and it was clear from the whispers in the halls and the outright cheers of congratulations, that everyone thought Harry had entered himself for the tournament. While the Slytherins were particularly unimpressed, the other houses seemed to be in a state of conflict. Plenty of people were being vocal in their support of Cassius. Apparently, he was more popular than Violet had first realized, fairly well-liked, and respected for his hard work in his classes. All the makings of a champion, but he was still a Slytherin. And apparently there were plenty of people who would rather have an illegal, underage, reluctant school champion than a Slytherin one. Violet would have been looking forward to care of magical creatures under normal circumstances, seeing Hagrid and her brother at the same time. But the class was shared with the rest of the Gryffindors as well, and all of them already had their minds made up about which champion they'd be supporting. The Gryffindors were already waiting when the Slytherins arrived at Hagrid's cabin. Before Violet could even open her mouth in greeting, Draco Malfoy had already opened his. "Ah, look, boys, it's the false champion," he said loudly to Crabbe and Goyle, the moment Harry was in earshot. "Got your autograph books? Better get a signature now, because I doubt he's going to be around much longer. Half the Triwizard champions have died. How long do you reckon you're going to last, Potter? 10 minutes into the first task's my bet." Crabbe and Goyle guffawed sycophantically. Violet was rolling up her sleeves, ready to cross the yard and hex Malfoy's mouth shut, but was held back by a frantic Tracy just in time. Hagrid had emerged from the back of his cabin, balancing a teetering tower of crates, each containing a very large blast-ended scroot. To the class's horror, Hagrid proceeded to explain that the reason the scroots had been killing one another was an excess of pent-up energy, and that the solution would be for each student to fix a leash on a scroot and take it for a short walk. The only good thing about this plan was that it distracted Malfoy completely. "Take this thing for a walk," he repeated in disgust, staring into one of the boxes. "And where exactly are we supposed to fix the leash?" "Around the sting, the blasting end, or the sucker?" "Round the middle," said Hagrid, demonstrating. "You might want her put on your dragonhide gloves, Zeus, as an extra precaution like. Harry, you come here and help me with this big one." It was obvious that Hagrid's real intention was to get Harry away from the rest of the class to speak to him, and Violet was desperate to join them. "Oh, please don't leave me alone with this thing," Tracy pleaded, as they gingerly looped the rope harness around the middle of the foul creature in front of them. No longer shellless and colorless, they had developed a kind of thick, grayish, shiny armor. They looked like a cross between giant scorpions and elongated crabs, but still without recognizable heads or eyes. They had become immensely strong and very hard to control. "I told you we should have stomped on them when they were small," Tracy grunted, struggling to keep hold of the tether as the scroot tugged and scuttled its way across the lawn. Violet, also holding onto the rope from directly behind the scroot, was inclined to agree. Every now and then, with an alarming bang, one of the scroots' ends would explode, causing it to shoot forward several yards, yanking its unfortunate handlers off their feet and dragging them along on their stomachs until they could get back up. The front of Violet's robes were already covered with grass and mud. "We can still try," she said through gritted teeth, "but now I think they might be able to stomp back." When the scroots were finally wrangled back into their crates at the end of class, Violet was finally able to make her way to Harry's side and ask him how he was feeling. "Fine," he said shortly, rubbing at the palms of his rope-burned hands. "Just peachy." "I know you didn't put your name in the goblet," Violet said quickly, struggling to keep up with Harry's brisk stride. He made no attempt to slow down for her. "Because I know you would have told me if you had mind telling Ron that," Harry snapped. "Ron, why would I need to tell Ron anything? He's your friend." "Funny thing, I thought that too." "What? Harry, what's that supposed to mean?" Did something, but the scowl on Harry's face made clear that he didn't want to talk about it. For the first time, Violet looked around and realized that neither Ron or Hermione was walking beside them. They were both up ahead, walking separately up to the castle. Harry didn't slow his stubborn stride, even as Violet came to a halt, walking straight past her and leaving her alone on the grounds. She stood there, staring worriedly at her brothers retreating back until Tracy caught up. "Everything all right?" Tracy asked, looking between Violet and Harry. "He didn't look too happy today, did he?" "Something's up with him and Ron," Violet muttered. "I just wish he'd talk to me." She looped her arm with Tracy's, and the two of them followed the rest of the class into the castle. Chapter 14. Testing the Barns. The next few days passed, without much trouble for Violet, at least. Everywhere she went people were still talking about Harry and the tournament, and everywhere Cassius went people would crowd around him to shake his hand, ask him if he was nervous, what his plans were for dealing with the other champions. Most annoyingly, there was a crowd of 6th and 7th year girls that had taken to hanging around Cass and following him around the castle between classes. They giggled at everything he said, even if it wasn't meant to be funny, and kept trying to push Violet and Tracy out of their usual seats at mealtimes. Cass wasn't doing very much to make them go away, either. "They aren't that bad," he said with a frown, after Tracy compared the girls to a swarm of nattering wasps, "and none of them have stung me yet, either." "Just you wait, because they're certainly stinging at me," Tracy said. Under her breath, so that only Violet could hear, she added, "None of them gave a whit about him before was named champion." Meanwhile, every time she caught sight of Harry, Violet was struck by just how alone he was. Whatever was happening with Ron had the pair of them avoiding each other, and poor Hermione was stuck flitting in between the arguing pair, trying to spend time with them both. Harry had no crowds of adoring fans and no trail of giggling girls following behind him. Every time Violet saw her brother, he just looked angry and tired and alone. She didn't even get another chance to approach him until Friday, when their other shared class, double potions, came around. But there would be no time to talk there. Either Professor Snape and the rest of the Slytherins all seemed determined to punish Harry as much as possible for becoming school champion and taking attention away from Cassius. Violet had waited around after lunch to catch up with Harry, and she joined him and Hermione in heading down the dungeons. The rest of the Slytherin class was already waiting outside. Each and every one of them, with the exception of a very furious-looking Tracy, was wearing a large badge on the front of their robes. For one wild moment Violet thought they were SPEW. Badges, then she saw that they all bore the same message, in luminous red letters that burned brightly in the dimly little underground passage. "Support Cassius Warrington, their Alhogwarts champion." "Like them, Potter," said Malfoy loudly as Harry approached. "And this isn't all they do, look." He pressed the badge into his chest, and the message upon it vanished, to be replaced by another one, which glowed green. "Potter stinks." The Slytherins howled with laughter. Each of them pressed their badges too, until the message "Potter stinks" was shining brightly all around Harry, whose face and neck had gone very red. Tracy hurriedly pushed her way over to Violet's side. "I told them to take them off," she whispered angrily. "But even Millie won't stop. They think they're all so clever, over-funny," Hermione said sarcastically to Pansy Parkinson, who was laughing harder than anyone else. "Reality." "Want one, Granger?" said Malfoy, holding out a badge to Hermione. "I've got loads, but don't touch my hand now. I've just washed it, you see. Don't want a mudblood sliming it up." There was a sudden flurry of motion as Harry and about half the Gryffindors all went for their wands. Malfoy's wand was out too, and he and Harry both had them pointed straight at each other. People all around them scrambled out of the way, backing down the corridor. "Harry," Hermione said warningly. "Go on then, Potter," Malfoy said quietly, drawing out his own wand. "Moody's not here to look after you now, do it. If you've got the guts." Violet saw a familiar glint in Harry's eyes and quickly stepped between the pair of them. Malfoy grinned, his wand now aimed squarely at her nose. "Oh, I forgot. Potter needs his sister to win his fights for him," he said nastily. "Are you going to win him the Triwizard Tournament too?" "Get out of the way, Violet," Harry said from behind her, his voice shaking with anger. Violet didn't budge. I'll take one of those badges, Malfoy, she said loudly. Malfoy blinked in surprise. What? Quick as a flash, Violet reached out with her right hand and yanked the glowing badge off the front of his robes. With her left hand, she slapped Malfoy across the face. Stay away from my brother, Violet said. She pinned the badge neatly to her own robes and examined it. And I think this looks better on me, actually. How dare you? Malfoy shrieked, clutching his reddened cheek. How dare you touch me, you be? And what is all this noise about? Said a soft, deadly voice. Professor Snape had arrived. Malfoy's gang clamored to give their explanations. Snape pointed a finger at Malfoy and said, "Explain." "Potter attacked me, sir." "Which Potter?" Snape said, turning to look at the twins. "I did," they both said at once. Harry was still clutching his wand. Snape raised an eyebrow and looked back to Malfoy. "Which?" "Shedded," Pansy hissed, pointing at Violet. She hit him right in the face with her hands, like an animal. Malfoy reluctantly allowed Pansy to pull his hand away from his face, showing off the bright red hand print Violet had left there. Professor Snape slowly turned to face Violet. "Is this true, Miss Potter?" "I did it," Harry said loudly, before Violet could even open her mouth. "She didn't touch him. I'm the one who— No, I did it," Violet said, louder still, and Harry nudged her angrily. Snape's black eyes were boring into her, but Violet held her ground and stared right back. With a confidence she did not feel, she said, "I'm the one who hit Malfoy, sir. He called Hermione a mudblood." Professor Snape looked swiftly back at Malfoy. Surprisingly, there was a flash of real anger across his pale face. 20 points from Slytherin," Snape said sharply to Malfoy, making the rest of the house groan. "And detention, Miss Potter, for fighting. Inside, all of you." Malfoy slunk past Snape into the classroom and slammed his bag down on the table. The Gryffindors were all looking shell-shocked. It wasn't often that Professor Snape took points from his own house, and never so many at once. Violet earned a few glares from her fellow Slytherins, but held her head high as she sat down beside her brother and Hermione. "You should have let me taken it," Harry whispered to her as they settled into their seats. "Snape would have been happy to blame me, no matter what Parkinson said. You're school champion, Harry," Violet whispered right back, ducking her head under the pretense of pulling out her books. "You've got to stay out of trouble, and I am the one who hit him." "Thank you, Violet," said Hermione. Violet flashed her a quick, genuine smile as Professor Snape took to the front of the room. "Antidotes," he said, looking around at them all, his cold black eyes glittering unpleasantly. "You should all have prepared your recipes now. I want you to brew them carefully, and then we will be selecting someone on whom to test one." Snape's eyes flicked toward their table, and Violet had the uneasy feeling that he re-elided me to poison Harry. She wondered if there was a way to talk him out of it, or somehow make him spill the poison before he could make Harry drink it. And then the dungeon door swung open, and Violet stopped worrying about poisons completely, because Sirius Black was standing in the doorway. He stepped confidently into the room, beaming at Harry and Violet. "There's my godson," Sirius said loudly, striding over to where the twins sat and clapping a hand on Harry's shoulder. The class, whose mouths had been hanging open in varying degrees of shock and alarm, all burst into fervent and excited whispers. "Dumbledore told me I might find you here, Harry." "Sirius, what are you doing here?" Harry said, gaping like the rest of them. "Rescuing you from class," said Sirius good-naturedly. "And I dare say you need to be rescued if this is the sort they've got passing for teachers these days." He shot a feral, two-toothy grin toward the front of the class where Snape was standing. Professor Snape's face had gone from its usual pallor to a blotchy, very ugly shade of brick red. His lips were drawn back in a silent snarl, and his eyes were plainly filled with loathing as they stared at Sirius Black. The two of them had been vicious enemies since childhood, and after the events of last year and Sirius' recent acquittal, neither of their feelings were likely to have changed. "Get out of my classroom," Snape snarled quietly. He had gone completely rigid, but his hands were shaking as they balled into fists at his sides. "More than happy to," said Sirius, patting Harry on the shoulder once more. "Come on, Harry, get your things. Potter has another hour of potions to complete," Snape spat. "He will be going nowhere." Harry, who had been rising eagerly out of his seat to go with Sirius, now flopped uncertainly back into it. Sirius' eyes flashed coldly as he rounded on Snape. "Well, I say he's coming with me, Snape. Harry, get your things. We're going upstairs now." "Potter, do not leave that chair," Snape shouted. Harry, once again, fell heavily back into his seat. All eyes in the classroom were now on Snape and Sirius as both dark-eyed men stared each other down. Sirius was taller, finely dressed, and even though he still bore the gauntness of his time in Azkaban, was more broad-shouldered and powerfully built. But this was the dungeon classroom, and Professor Snape's domain. Never before had he looked so menacing as did now in his billowing black robes, standing beside his large desk with rage etched deeply into his harsh features. Sirius took a step forward. It looked as though he was itching to go for his wand. There was knock from the doorway. All eyes swiveled toward the back of the class as little Colin Creevey stepped calmly into the room, smiling and oblivious to the tension around him. He walked straight past Sirius and stopped in front of Professor Snape. "Yes," said Snape through clenched teeth. "Please, sir, I'm supposed to take Harry Potter upstairs." If Violet had thought the look on Snape's face couldn't be any more terrible, she was sorely mistaken. His features twisted as he stood there, uneven teeth gnashing as he stared down his long nose at Colin. "Fine," Snape hissed at last, little more than a whisper. "Take him and get out of my sight." "Nothing would make me happier than not having to look at you any more," said Sirius nastily. He looked back to Harry and grinned. "Coming!" Harry practically leapt out his seat in his eagerness to join Sirius. Violet, looking anxiously between them, got a fond pat on the shoulder from Sirius as well. "Don't worry, Violet, I'm just borrowing him for a bit," he said warmly. "Ludo Bagman's upstairs with Dumbledore. They're bringing all the champions up to have their photographs taken. Why don't you come join us after class is out? We'll have a little dinner in Mooney's office." Without so much as a backwards glance at Professor Snape, but sparing a jaunty wave for the rest of the staring class, Sirius led Harry and Colin Creevey out of the classroom and shut the door behind them with a snap. A tense, dangerous silence hung in the air. People were looking back and forth between Violet and Professor Snape, as though they didn't know which person would be more interesting to stare at. Violet, who hated to be the subject of stares anyways, ducked her head and tried to disappear into the collar of her robes. Snape presented a far more compelling subject. His face was still red and blotchy, and his hands kept clenching and unclenching at his sides, as though he were itching to reach out and strangle the first student who dared to ask him what that was all about. The class was extremely quiet and well-behaved for the rest of the lesson. Even the most minor infraction was seized upon by Professor Snape, the perpetrator forced to bear the brunt of his misplaced anger. Points were taken for things like sneezing too loudly, taking too many notes, clinking the stirring spoon against the cauldron too many times, and in Malfoy's case, fiddling with his flashing badge too often. He must have replaced the one Violet took off him with another, and was determined to make it stay on Thepater Stink's message. With Harry being absent, it was poor Neville Longbottom who was chosen to test the effectiveness of his antidote. Looking very green and nervous, Neville slowly made his way to the front of the class and presented Professor Snape with a vial of his potion. It was pale blue and close enough to the proper consistency that Violet wasn't worried about him. But it was still a horrible sight. Snape produced a small metal goblet from his robes and poured a measure of clear, innocuous-looking liquid into it before pushing it into Neville's trembling hands. Looking like he might die of a heart attack before the poison even reached his lips, Neville squeezed his eyes shut and drained the goblet. For a moment, all he did was stand there. He looked around, blinking in surprise that he hadn't dropped dead straight away, and then a shock of purple crept up the side of his throat, and he began to cough. Professor Snape handed Neville his vial of antidote, which he very nearly dropped while trying to uncork, and he hurried swallowed the whole concoction, sputtering painfully as the purple blotch began to spread across his throat. Snape pulled out a pocket watch and timed how long it took for the antidote to take effect. It took a full, agonizing minute for Neville to begin breathing normally again, and another 3 minutes for the color of his skin to go back to normal. Your unicorn horn was not crushed finely enough, Longbottom, Professor Snape said as Neville staggered back to his seat, still looking quite winded. The rest of you bring your antidotes up to my desk, then gather your things and get out. We'll find out how many of you have failed by next week. Dismissed. In little groups, everyone brought a sample of their potion up to the little racks sitting on Snape's desk. Murmurs were already breaking out about what had happened at the beginning of the class, but only well out of Snape's earshot. Violet was certain his showdown with Sirius Black would be all over the school by the dinner time. Violet had just finished gathering her things, ready to follow Tracy out the door, when Professor Snape called her back. "Yes, sir," she said nervously, approaching the desk again. Snape was meticulously straightening the rows of jumbled vials that had been left for him. "Your detention will be tonight at 7, he informed her. "Come to my office straight after dinner. If you're late, I'll have you serving it with Mr. Filch instead understood. "Understood, sir," Violet said sheepishly. She turned to go. "Potter," Snape called sharply, and Violet whipped back around. "Sir, why are you wearing that ridiculous thing?" His gaze was on the front of her robes. Violet looked down at herself, and at the glowing green badge which still prominently displayed the word spotter stinks, and felt her face go red. "Oh, it matches my eyes." Snape's eyes widened momentarily, then narrowed to a dangerous squint. "7 sharp, Potter," he said tersely, and waved her away. Violet practically sprinted from the classroom, her face burning. "It matches my eyes." Of all the silly, stupid things to say, Professor Lupin was not in his office when Violet arrived. She knocked, several times, at increasingly louder volumes. But when there was no answer, she resigned herself to sitting cross-legged on the floor in the corridor outside and leafing through her history of magic homework. When Professor Lupin did show up, he nearly tripped over her. "Violet," he said, staggering to a halt. "What on earth are you doing out here?" "Sorry I knocked, but you weren't in." Violet hastily stowed her books away and took Lupin's offered hand. He pulled her easily to her feet. "Yes, I had some tidying up to do after my last lesson. My 6th years got a little overexcited during their debate about the status of hags." He shook his head, smiling even though he looked quite frazzled. "Here, let's go inside. And for the record, Violet, you're welcome in my office at any time, even if I'm not in it. I know how difficult it can be to find some peace and quiet in the castle at times." He held the door open and let Violet enter first. As she did, she saw his eyes drop to the badge on her chest. "I've been confiscating those all day, you know," Lupin said, gently closing the door behind himself, "on the grounds of bullying. But as Itziao wearing one, I admit I'm at a bit of a loss. Please don't tell you actually bought that." "I didn't," Violet said cheerily. "I nicked it off Malfoy. As your teacher, I am appalled at your behavior," Lupin said, mock sternly, "but as your godfather, I am very proud. Give me just a moment to put these away, and then we can talk." Violet plopped down in front of Lupin's desk and watched as he produced a thick stack of parchment from his battered brown briefcase, tapped them on the table to even them out, then stowed them away in a drawer, which he opened and closed with a small key. "Essays," he said by way of explanation, closing the briefcase and tucking it away as well. "I need to figure out a better filing system, I'm afraid." There now he settled himself behind the desk, clasped his hands professionally, and said with a smile, "What can I do for you, Miss Potter?" "Oh, actually I thought Harry and Sirius would be here by now," Violet said. "Sirius," Lupin repeated. There was a note of confusion in his voice. "Why would Sirius be here?" "Well, he said we'd be having dinner in here tonight, just the 4 of us." Lupin was frowning now. "This is the first I'm hearing of it." "When exactly did Sirius tell you this?" 2 hours ago," Violet said, her face heating up. She was starting to feel foolish. Had she misheard? Had Sirius taken Harry off on some little adventure for just the two of them and lied to keep her from feeling left out? He pulled Harry out of potions to go take photos with Mr. Bagman. I think. Comprehension dawned on Professor Lupin's prematurely lined face. He closed his eyes. Oh, no. Violet startled as Lupin got abruptly to his feet. You said he's with Harry now, he asked, shuffling around the desk. And there'll be cameras, of course, damn him. Professor Lupin yanked open the door to his office, clearly ready to storm out of it, but came to yet another abrupt halt to avoid running into someone. This time it was Harry. Harry, Lupin said, sounding very relieved. Harry blinked up at him in surprise. He still had his hand raised, poised to knock. He dropped it quickly. Hello, sir. Is something the matter? I can't believe you, said Professor Lupin angrily, and Violet feared it was directed at Harry, but then Sirius laughed and pushed his way into the office, and she understood. Good to see you, too, Remus, Sirius said casually. He glanced interestedly around the office before his eyes landed on Violet, and a wide grin spread across his face. Violet. Good, you made it sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to just whisk Harry away and leave you there snivelous. Didn't give you too much trouble, did he? I who? He means Professor Snape, said Lupin firmly, standing in front of the door with his arms crossed. Sirius, I wish you wouldn't call him that. You never objected to it when we were in school, Sirius said, sounding put out. Lupin shook his head. Well, we're not in school any longer. Severus is a grown man, and so are we. I think it's about time we all started being a little more respectful toward one another. When Sirius opened his mouth, looking about to protest, Lupin added loudly, if only to set a better example for those who look up to us. He looked pointedly at Harry and Violet. Sirius shut his mouth and sighed. Fine, fine. Harry, come and sit down. I know you must be starving after all of that hard work. With a wave of his wand, a handsome light brown wood, newly purchased from Ollivander's Sirius, conjured a whole baked chicken, a platter of roasted potatoes, a dish of rich-looking stew, a little plate of steaming bread rolls, and a pitcher of ice-cold pumpkin juice, right on top of Professor Lupin's desk. What did you have to do? Violet asked eagerly as her brother took the seat beside her. Professor Lupin wordlessly conjured another chair for Sirius, and the four of them tucked in to eat. Harry's cheeks went a bit red. He's joking, he muttered. All we had to do was stand around and have our pictures taken. And then that Skeeter woman wanted interviews, but Harry glanced sidelong at Sirius, who was nonchalantly buttering a roll. But what? Said Lupin mildly, now also looking at Sirius. Harry dropped his gaze guiltily. But I, didn't get a chance to speak with her, he said, then quickly went about stuffing his face with potatoes so that he couldn't talk any more. I can't believe Dumbledore allowed that harpy into the school, Sirius said, especially after that piece she wrote about him over the summer. You should have seen the way she was eyeing Harry, like he was a piece of meat she wanted to sink her talons into. I'm sure Dumbledore has his reasons, Lupin said mildly. Much like he had his reasons for letting you into the school, Sirius. I have every right to be here, Sirius said, affronted, around a mouthful of bread. I'm family. They'd have a tough time trying to keep me out. As I said, Dumbledore had his reasons. Lupin endured Sirius' glare, eyes twinkling, and the pair of them lapsed into silence as they enjoyed their food. It felt very odd to eat like this, away from the noise and bustle of the great hall, but it wasn't uncomfortable at all. Violet and Harry were able to chat between bites without fear of reproach, and both Lupin and Sirius were more than happy to pass food in their direction and encourage them to take more portions. Violet could almost imagine, in another life, that this might be what it's like to enjoy a family meal. But she doubted very much whether typical family meals were interspersed with talk of facing life and death competitions. The challenges themselves aren't what I'm worried about, Sirius said gravely, pausing with a spoonful of stew in the air. He was looking sidelong at Professor Lupin, as though waiting for him to interrupt. There are other dangers that I need to warn you about. What? Said Harry, looking as though he were preparing to take a bullet. Karkaroff, said Sirius. He looked again at Lupin, who was steely-eyed but silent. Harry, he was a Death Eater. You know what Death Eaters are, don't you? Voldemort's followers, Violet said at once. Sirius nodded. He was caught. He was in Azkaban with me, but he got released. I bet everything that's why Dumbledore wanted an aura at Hogwarts this year to keep an eye on him. Moody is the one who caught Karkaroff and put him in Azkaban in the first place. Karkaroff got released, Harry said slowly, looking just as stunned as Violet felt. Why did they release him? He did a deal with the Ministry of Magic, said Sirius bitterly. He said he'd seen the error of his ways, and then he named names. He put a load of people into Azkaban in his place. He's not very popular in there, I can tell you. And since he got out, from what I can tell, he's been teaching the dark arts to every student who passes through that school of his. Though we can't be sure of that, Lupin added swiftly. There was plenty of opposition to his appointment as headmaster of Durmstrang, and I'm sure he's under close watch by the parents and board of governors. But watch out for the Durmstrang champion as well, said Sirius. Okay, said Harry slowly. But are you saying Karkaroff put my name in the goblet? Because if he did, he's a really good actor. He seemed furious about it. He wanted to stop me from competing. We know he's a good actor, said Sirius, because he convinced the Ministry of Magic to set him free, didn't he? Now, I've been keeping an eye on Thedley Prophet, Harry, and reading between the lines of that Skeeter woman's article last month. Moody was attacked the night before he started at Hogwarts. Yes, I know she says it was another false alarm, Sirius said hastily, seeing Harry about to speak. But I don't think so, somehow. I think someone tried to stop him from getting to Hogwarts. I think someone knew their job would be a lot more difficult with him around. And no one's going to look into it too closely. Mad Eye's heard intruders a bit too often. But that doesn't mean he can't still spot the real thing. Moody was the best aura the Ministry ever had. So, what are you saying? Said Violet. That Karkaroff is the one trying to kill Harry. But why? There's no evidence of that, Violet, Lupin said quickly, reaching across the table to put a hand on her arm. Karkaroff is the most obvious suspect, yes, but that doesn't mean he's solely responsible. So there could be more than one person out to get me, said Harry. Sirius hesitated. I've been hearing some very strange things, he said slowly. The old Death Eaters seem to be a bit more active than usual lately. They showed themselves at the Quidditch World Cup, didn't they? Someone set off the Dark Mark. And then did you hear about that Ministry of Magic witch who's gone missing? Bertha Jorkins, said Violet. Exactly. She disappeared in Albania, and there's definitely where Sirius, Lupin interrupted. I think that's far enough. What? Said Harry, looking between the two adults. That's definitely where what? Sirius grimaced, locked eyes with Lupin, and then said very quickly, that's the last place Voldemort was rumored to be. Sirius. They have a right to know, Remus. These are their very lives at stake. They also have a right to. Lupin scrubbed his hands over his face in frustration. They have a right to be 13 and not have to be looking over their shoulders every moment of the day. We're not scared, said Harry hotly. Just because we're 14 doesn't mean. It means that this conversation has gone far enough for tonight, Professor Lupin said firmly. Harry, Violet, I'm sorry, but I'm putting my foot down. We can talk about something else if you like, though it is getting a bit late, and I expect Sirius will need to be going soon. Wait, what time is it? Violet asked, suddenly alarmed. Lupin pulled out his battered silver pocket watch and showed her the time. It was nearly 7. Oh no, I've got to go. Where? Sirius asked. I've got detention, Violet said, hastily getting to her feet. Sirius' eyebrows shot up. You've got detention. What for? Well, she hit Malfoy, Harry said, with a note of pride in his voice. And stole his badge, too. Sirius looked at Violet's front and noticed, for the first time, the badge which still read Potter stinks in bright green, glowing letters. He threw his head back and laughed. Serves the little bugger right if he made something like that. Who's your detention with? If it's McGonagall, I have half a mind to go with you. It'd be nice to see her again, especially in detention. Ah, brings back memories. It's, Professor Snape, Violet mumbled quietly. Unless I'm late, then it'll be with Filch, he said. Snape, said Sirius, the smile vanishing from his face. In that case, I'm definitely coming with you. No, no, it's all right, Violet said quickly as he started getting up. Really, it's fine, Sirius. It's not that bad. Is this a real detention, Violet, or another one of your lessons? Professor Lupin asked mildly, and Violet's heart sank. Harry looked around at her. Lessons? What lessons? Some of the panic must have shown on Violet's face, because Lupin coughed quietly and said, Sorry, never mind that. Violet, go on ahead. We can speak later about. Is Snape giving you lessons or something? Harry blurted, staring at her. Ah, Violet cringed. Yeah, for how long? A while. What sort of lessons? Sirius demanded suspiciously. What's that slime ball been teaching you, Violet? It's just potions, she said quickly, which was the truth. Just like advanced potions and how to handle ingredients and the like. Since when, though? Demanded Harry. Violet hesitated. Second year. A look of deepest betrayal came over Harry's face. And you never told me, he said angrily. All this time he's been giving you detentions. They were actually lessons. It's not a big deal, Harry. It's just, of course it's a big deal, Harry countered, eyes flashing. You've been in detention with him loads of times, and I thought he. Harry seemed to be chewing on his words, biting them back the way he always had around the Dursleys. But the Dursleys weren't here, and things were different at home now. He didn't have to swallow his anger back like he did before. I thought he hated you as much as he hates me, he said bitterly. But I guess you're just another one of his Slytherin favorites, aren't you? This is exactly why I didn't tell you, Harry, Violet snapped, suddenly annoyed, because I knew you'd take it personally. Bit hard not to, Harry said. Especially seeing as you're the one getting top marks in potions, thanks to his help. Hey, I've always been good at potions. That's why Professor Snape took me aside in the first place. Took you under his wing, did he? Harry sneered, with a hard hurt set to his jaw. One of those big, giant bat wings. Wonder what that must be like. Violet opened her mouth to point out that Harry had had plenty of favoritism shown to him in the past, most notably by Professor McGonagall, who recruited him for the Gryffindor Quidditch team when he was just a first year. But before she could add more fuel to the fire, there was a great, distant tolling of a bell. 7 o'clock had arrived, and she was late. May I be excused, sir? She said sharply to Professor Lupin, who nodded, looking apologetic. Yes, of course, Violet. You can tell Severus it was my fault for keeping you. But Violet was already out the door, running as fast as her legs would carry her to the dungeons. Getting through the great hall was a trial of itself. The great wooden doors were wide open, with students from all schools pouring through it into the entryway. Violet slipped nimbly through the crowd, squeezing through tightly packed groups of friends with ease. She heard someone calling her name from the crowd, but didn't bother looking back. Cass and Tracy could wait. They couldn't make her scrub toilets for 3 hours, no matter how angry they got with her. Shoes pounding on the cold stone floor, Violet took the steps into the dungeons 2 at a time and practically flew down the corridor. The door to the potions classroom banged loudly against the wall as she flung it open and threw herself across the threshold. I'm so sorry I'm late, sir. I was with Professor Lupin. Violet stood stock still, staring. Professor Snape was standing at the front of the classroom in front of the blackboard, which was half full of his cramped, angled lettering, and beside him stood Professor Karkaroff. Both men were staring back at Violet in alarm, clearly surprised by her noisy entrance. Karkaroff looked as though he'd gone for his wand. His hand dropped quickly back to his side. Violet couldn't stop staring at him. Potter, Snape said, and her eyes flicked to him instead. Sit down. Your detention started 3 minutes ago. Why, yes, sir, Violet said, swallowing nervously. It took a great deal of willpower to make herself walk further into the classroom. Every step she took toward her desk felt like lifting a ton of bricks, dragging them behind her as she walked. Professor Karkaroff was watching her out of the corner of his eye, just as she was watching him, though he had turned back to face Professor Snape. When Violet finally reached her chair and sat down, she heard him say, "We will speak again, Severus, when there is more time. It is good to see you again, old friend." "Another time, Igor," Snape said, his expression unreadable. He stiffened when Karkaroff patted him on the shoulder, smiling, and his black eyes followed carefully as the other man left the room. Violet held her breath as the Durmstrang headmaster passed by her desk, but he didn't spare her so much as a glance. She didn't breathe until the door clicked shut behind him. There was a tension in the air as Professor Snape turned slowly to face Violet, who was suddenly feeling very small at her desk. She could hear Sirius' voice echoing in her head, words he had told her only minutes ago. "He's a Death Eater. You know what Death Eaters are, don't you?" "You're late, Potter," Professor Snape said sharply, making her jump. "And I thought I had specifically warned you not to be." "I was with Professor Lupin," Violet repeated quickly. And then, because she couldn't help herself, "How do you and Professor Karkaroff know each other, sir?" Snape's eyes flashed coldly. "I don't believe that's any of your business, Potter," he said in his most soft and dangerous voice. Violet shut her mouth and swallowed again. Snape, mercifully, took his eyes off her and turned around once more. "Now, seeing as you are incapable of following even the simplest of directions, I doubt you be able to keep up with the demands of this evening's task, minimal though they are." Violet watched in dismay as Professor Snape began to erase the contents of the blackboard, which she could see now were the directions for the potion he'd planned to teach her to brew. Worse, once the board was clean, he began to write on it once more in larger, fewer words. "I think it only fair that you're set a task which you are capable of completing," he said coldly, stepping back from the board. The words "he will not strike my fellow students" were plainly written, and there was an unpleasant smile on Professor Snape's pale face. 250 lines, Potter, on my desk by the end of the night. I expect them to be neat and legible, is that clear? "Yes, sir," Violet said mournfully, pulling out her parchment and quill. "You are fortunate that Mr. Filch is otherwise occupied this evening," Professor Snape told her. "Otherwise, I would have handed you over to his." "Mercy," Violet grimaced slightly. Filch's detentions were widely known to be the most grueling, disgusting ventures in manual labor possible, and the man himself took undeniable glee in the suffering of students. "Still," Snape continued, "it is my hope that your current assignment will instill some measure of discipline in you. Merlin knows you're unlikely to develop it in Lupin's company." Violet's quill, which was halfway through her second line, stopped on the parchment. He was goading her, of course, and it would be deeply unwise to rise to the bait. She forced herself to take a breath, bite her tongue, and keep writing, but not before a blot of black ink had blossomed on the page, spreading to muddy the words she had already written. Professor Snape, who had moved down the aisle to hover menacingly over her, did not miss it. "Have you become hard of hearing, Potter, since last you were in my class, or are you being purposefully obtuse? I said I wanted your work to be legible, did I not?" Violet swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. So you can hear. Good. Dispose of this parchment and start over." Under Snape's cold gaze, Violet dutifully gathered another page from her bag and started anew. This time she was very careful to keep her quill in motion and not give in to nerves, even when Professor Snape began circling. It was a familiar tactic, and one he often employed during potions lessons, especially exams, moving slowly around the room, watchful eyes on the lookout for any mistake or sign of misconduct. It was bad enough when the room was full of other people, but to be the sole focus of Snape's attention was enough to make the hairs on her neck stand on end. When Violet was on her 8th line, Snape started in again. "How remarkable that Lupin should already prove himself to be a poor influence upon you, Potter, given that he had such a late start on the endeavor." The sneer in Snape's voice was evident. "One would think a man of his condition would be better at keeping track of time." She must have done something to upset him, Violet decided, beyond just her tardiness. Sirius's interruption had angered him greatly. Professor Snape was only ever this cruel when he was in a truly foul mood. And from his next words, it was clear that he was only getting started. I would expect such disregard for rules and the valuable time of others from your brother. But as a member of my house, I had come to expect better of you. How foolish of me. It would seem that to place any expectations upon the blessed Potters is to invite disappointment. Professor Snape vanished out of her periphery, his voice now coming from behind her. Violet carefully daubed the excess ink from the tip of her quill, staying silent, trying to keep her breathing even. When Snape appeared beside her again, this time on her right, she made sure to keep her head down. He was trying to upset her. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing that it was working. But then, Snape had always had a knack for twisting the knife. Then again, Lupin himself cannot solely be to blame. I suspect Black. He spat Sirius' name as though it were poison, made good on his threats of lunching with him. Tell me, did he require all of you to join him in eating scraps from the floor, or was that simply his own preferred means of dining? Violet clenched her jaw so tightly it made her teeth ache. Professor Snape continued to circle her slowly. I can see it now, he went on, a sneer evident in his voice. Two greying hounds, fumbling after a pair of pups. It's just like your idiot father to place the care of his offspring into the claws of the two people the least capable of caring even for themselves. He was always happy letting others clean up whatever messes his faultless self left behind. I will not strike my fellow students. I will not strike my fellow students. I will not strike, I suppose, must be an inherited trait, Snape continued, to have an utter lack of respect for authority. Your father had a true gift for it of all the things to pass on to his children. He tutted mockingly. Not that he had much else to give. The ability to balance on a broomstick could only carry one so far in life, though the spectacle it creates seems enough to carry them the rest of the way as far as James Potter was concerned. Stop it. Snape, who had just come around to the front of her desk, looked at her sharply. What was that? Violet's mouth had gone very dry. There was no ringing this time, only the sound of blood roaring like a waterfall in her ears. She set her quill to the side before it could ruin her parchment again and said, Stop talking about my father. She didn't have to look up to know that Professor Snape was sneering at her. She could feel disdain in his gaze, see it in his rigid posture and the tight, sanctimonious clasp of his hands behind his back. He turned to face her. Does it bother you, Potter, to hear such things about him? Snape asked softly, and it was the softness that made it truly cruel. They're all true others, may be content to lie, and coddle you with stories about what Agrateman James Potter was. How gallant, how heroic, how brave was, when all he did and had ever done was ride the coattails of his family's name and take credit for the accomplishments of those far more clever than himself. Did you imagine him as a saint, fighting against injustice to make the world a better place? Allow me, then, to free you from such ridiculous notions. Your blessed father was a swine who never did anything unless it made him look good. Stop it, Violet repeated, louder than before. Why should I? Snape scoffed bitterly. Someone has to banish these delusions of grandeur you possess. Lupin and Black and the rest may fill your head with rubbish and rot about the sort of man your father was, but they forget I knew him, too. Over 7 unbearable years of his company, I got to know exactly the sort of man your father was. That's not fair, Violet cried. Snape laughed harshly. It was a truly ugly sound. Fair, he taunted, leaning now over her desk. Life is frequently unfair, Potter, something your father took great joy in ensuring. It's not fair Thatiaget to know him, and I didn't. Violet shouted, hurt and anger making her bold. It's not fair that you got to spend more time with him than I did. Professor Snape straightened up abruptly, looking stunned. Violet had never raised her voice to him like this. Harry was always the one to snap back against his abuse, while she had only ever sat there and cried. But while tears were indeed pricking at the corners of her eyes, the predominant emotion coursing through Violet's body was outrage. both her hands clenched into trembling fists atop her desk. "How is it my fault that my dad was a prat to you in school?" she went on, glaring fiercely at Professor Snape. "It's not Harry's fault either, just because he looks like him. Our dad's dead. He was murdered before we were old enough to remember him, same as our mum. Say something nasty about her for a change. Why don't you?" Snape's black eyes flew wide. There was a flash of something in them, just a flash that Violet was too angry to try and focus on. "Go on, you must have known my mother too, so tell me something awful about her," Violet pressed. "Like how she cheated off your tests, or tripped you in the hallways, or whatever stupid grudges you've been holding on to since you were 12. "Enough," Snape snapped, as though Violet had been the one to instigate this fight. "No, really, go on and tell me about her, since you've got so much to say about my dead parents," she said, trembling but determined to dig her heels in. "All anyone ever says to me is that I've got her eyes, so I'd actually like to hear something else for a change." "Go on." "I said enough." Professor Snape had gone even paler than usual. He looked uncharacteristically stunned in the face of her ire, as though she had someone managed to cut him to the quick. Violet continued to glare at him, seething. She flinched, however, when Snape reached out and snatched the parchment of half-finished lines off her desk and crumpled them into a ball in his fist. He pointed to the door. "Get out." Violet didn't have to be told twice. She shoved her quill back into her bag, not caring that it was probably leaking ink everywhere, and jumped angrily to her feet. She stormed past Professor Snape and yanked open the classroom door, but paused on the threshold. "I almost forgot," Violet said, turning back. "I wanted to thank you, sir." Snape, still standing beside her empty desk, narrowed his eyes at her. For telling the truth at Sirius's trial." "Dumbledore said you come around to doing the right thing eventually." Violet paused to gulp, and then added, boldly, "But I had my doubts." And then, before he could say anything else, Violet turned away from Professor Snape's shocked face and yanked the door shut behind her so hard that it rattled in its hinges. Chapter 15. Lies and Lizards. The next fortnight passed in something of a blur. Lessons ran together, homework piled up, and the teachers seemed to be expecting more from all of them all the time, despite the distraction the upcoming tournament posed. Violet's bag was heavier every day as she lugged it between classes, made even heavier by the weight of all the eyes on her as she moved through the chilly halls. Harry hadn't been quite truthful when he said that he hadn't gotten to speak with Rita Skeeter. The newest issue of Thedley Prophet had come out with her report on the Triwizard Tournament, which had turned out to be less of a report on the tournament and more of a highly colored life story of Harry. Much of the front page had been given over to a picture of Harry. The article, continuing on pages 2, 6, and 7, had been all about Harry, while the names of the Beauxbatons and Durmstrang champions, misspelled, had been squashed into the last line of the article, and Cassius hadn't been mentioned at all. The article had appeared 10 days ago and had spread through the entire school like wildfire. Rita Skeeter had reported Harry saying an awful lot of things that Violet was certain he's never said in his life, let alone to some nosy reporter. "I suppose I get my strength from my parents. I know they'd be very proud of me if they could see me now. Yes, sometimes at night I still cry about them. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I know nothing will hurt me during the tournament because they're watching over me." Rita Skeeter had come to an awful lot of conclusions about Harry's life and feelings, but worse were her assumptions about Sirius. Someone had managed to snap a photograph of him holding tight to Harry's arm, scowling at the camera and looking undeniably unpleasant. Since his highly suspect acquittal and release from Azkaban, former notorious mass murderer Sirius Black has somehow worked his way into the good graces of young Harry Potter, claiming to be not only a close friend of the boy's deceased parents, but his legal godfather. Harry seems to have accepted this with naive wholeheartedness. It is clear that Black, once the most feared and famous of you-know-who's followers, now holds in a position of enormous influence over both of the Potter children. As if that wasn't bad enough, Rita Skeeter had interviewed other people about him too. Harry has at last found love at Hogwarts. His close friend, Carlin Creevy, says that Harry is rarely seen out of the company of one Hermione Granger, a stunningly pretty muggle-born girl who, like Harry, is one of the top students in the school. From the moment the article had appeared, students had been doing renditions of it in the halls, quoting it at Harry and making sneering comments as he passed. The Slytherins, Violet was ashamed to say, were particularly bad about it. The omission of Cassius from the list of school champions rankled deeply. Slytherin House so rarely got any positive attention that being pushed out of the limelight was enough to turn even the sweetest of them sour. "Here, take this," Susanna Runcorn had said, thrusting a handkerchief beneath a very bewildered Violet's nose. "For your brother, in case he starts crying in Transfiguration or something." As much as this stung, Violet knew she wasn't getting anything near the worst of it. Even Hermione had it worse than her. Stunningly pretty. Huh, Pansy Parkinson had shrieked the first time she had come face to face with Hermione after Rita's article had appeared. What was she judging against a chipmunk? Maybe just compared to you, seeing as you look like the wrong end of a flabberworm. Violet had snapped at Pansy after the third time she made that sort of remark. While Pansy reacted poorly, Violet didn't feel even a little bit bad about what she'd said, not even when house points were taken from her by a very disappointed Professor Flitwick. She could only imagine what Harry must be going through. While she and Hermione had gone through a terrifying time travel ordeal together the year before, Violet didn't know if they were quite close enough for her to asking if there was any truth to Rita Skeeter's rumors. It was true that Harry and Hermione were spending a lot of time together, but this was largely in thanks to the fact that Ron still wasn't speaking to him. But then, Harry wasn't speaking much to Violet nowadays, either. Violet had always known that hiding her private potions lessons from her brother was walking a knife's edge between omitting the truth and outright lying to him. Harry definitely saw it as the latter. He refused to even look at her during meals and when they passed each other in the hallways, and for all the lessons they shared, Harry had made a point to find a different partner to work with. On the brief occasions that he'd acknowledge her, it was with clipped tones and an icy stare. The worst part of it all was that Violet knew she deserved it. Harry had every right to feel as hurt and betrayed as he did. His rivalry with Professor Snape had been brewing since their very first day of school, and if he'd really believed that Violet was suffering Snape's temper, too, only to learn that she was getting special treatment from him instead. She might as well have just slapped him across the face as well, like she'd done to Malfoy. Part of her wanted to tell Harry about how awfully her last meeting with Professor Snape had gone, that it really had been a detention after all, and how angry Snape was with her, and all the horrible things he'd said about their father. But the truth was that now her anger had worn off. Violet had become extremely nervous that the way she'd talked back to Professor Snape had gotten her into more trouble than she'd realized. Snape had barely called on her in class over the last 2 weeks, and hadn't called her back to finish her interrupted detention. She had the most absurd urge to go and apologize for being disrespectful to him, but the cruel remarks he'd made about her father, still rattling around the back of Violet's head, were enough to make her hold her tongue. But as horrible as Violet was feeling, she knew that she by no means had it the worst. No one had been hit harder by Cass being ignored in the paper than Cass himself. He had been so excited the morning the paper was delivered, and so swiftly disappointed as he pored over the article searching for any mention of his name. Disappointment quickly turned into bitterness, which had dominated his mood over the last 2 weeks. "You know he didn't ask for this," Violet had told him angrily more than once, but Cass only shook his head. "But that's what they want to hear about, isn't it?" he said. "Who gives a whit about the rest of us when famous Harry Potter is out there, risking his life to make his dead parents proud?" "They were my parents, too," Violet had snapped then, before running off before anyone could see her crying. Just like Harry, there was no talking to Cass nowadays. He was too angry, and when he wasn't being hurtful, he was off surrounded by his crowds of loyal admirers. All of Slytherin House had banded together to support him, and Malfoy's flashing badges were on almost every chest in the common room. Violet hadn't been able to stomach her stolen prize any longer. The irony of her wearing it wasn't funny anymore, so she had stuffed it into the bottom drawer of her bedside table with all the other trinkets she'd amassed over the years. Tracy, too, refused to wear a badge in solidarity. It was a sign of just how badly things were going for Violet lately that this small act of kindness was enough to make her burst into tears. On the Saturday before the first task, all students in the third year and above were permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade. Violet was practically itching to get out of the oppressive atmosphere of the castle. As she and Tracy queued with the rest in the entrance hall, bundled up in their cloaks and scarves, Violet looked around for Harry's face in the crowd. She'd hoped they might get a chance to meet up and talk over a butterbeer, talk things out and make up, but there was no sign of him. Ron was walking with Fred and George, and Hermione seemed to be by herself. Perhaps Harry had decided to enjoy the peace and quiet of the castle, devoid of its jeering occupants. But no one seemed to pay Rita Skeeter's article any mind in Hogsmeade. It was a beautiful, crisp November day, and the thrill of being back in Hogsmeade was more than enough to take people's minds off of bullying Harry. It always felt a little funny to be walking through Hogsmeade with Tracy, however. She and Violet both made pains to avoid the largest of the village's parks. It was all dried up and dead now, with nothing but frost on the stems and branches. But in the spring, it was bursting with flowers and leaves in every color imaginable. A beautiful place, which held bittersweet memories for Violet. The park had been the site of her first kiss, just a year earlier. Unfortunately, the recipient of the kiss Tracy hadn't returned her feelings. Things were swiftly mended between them once they got all the awkwardness and misunderstanding out of the way. But Violet still felt a pang of humiliation whenever she thought about it. There hadn't been any kisses since then, and Violet was starting to doubt whether there would ever be any kisses in her future either. Her feelings for Tracy were genuine, a sort of adoration, and a giddiness that made her insides feel like they were filled with bursting bubbles, though slightly muddled, with the knowledge that they weren't reciprocated. And Violet was becoming painfully aware of how other people looked at her whenever she was caught looking at someone she found attractive. While a handful of boys had caught her eye, Bill and Charlie Weasley, most recently and notably so far, most of those people were other girls. No one had yet called her out for these sorts of feelings, but having grown up listening to Uncle Vernon's speeches on the matter, Violet knew that such things were considered abnormal. She'd thought that maybe things would be different in the wizarding world, but the curious way Mr. Weasley had looked at her when she'd been caught staring at the villa gave Violet the sickening impression that things weren't very different at all. Hurrying out of the cold, and past all the uncomfortable memories the park brought up, Violet and Tracy stepped into the Three Broomsticks pub and stomped the snow off their boots before finding a table. The Three Broomsticks was packed, mainly with Hogwarts students enjoying their free afternoon, but also with a variety of magical people Violet rarely saw anywhere else. Violet supposed that as Hogsmeade was the only all-wizard village in Britain, it was a bit of a haven for creatures like hags, who were not as adept as wizards at disguising themselves. In the corner, Violet spotted Ron sitting with Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, but there was no sign of either Harry or Hermione. "I'll go get us drinks," Tracy said excitedly, disappearing into the crowd before Violet could stop her. It was very warm in the Three Broomsticks, and their table was close enough to the fire for Violet's heavy cloak and scarf to go from comfortable to unbearable. She took a moment to pull them both off and set to the side, and when she looked back up again, the other side of the table was no longer unoccupied. A woman that Violet had never seen before was sitting across from her, smiling. "Hello, Violet," the woman said, offering her hand, which Violet shook automatically. "How are you today, dear?" Her hair was set in elaborate and curiously rigid curls that contrasted oddly with her heavy-jawed face. She wore jeweled spectacles. The thick fingers now gripping her hand, Violet noticed, ended in 2-inch nails, painted crimson. Hello, Violet said warily. Do I know you? We haven't had the pleasure of being introduced, no, but I feel as though I already know everything about you. I had a lovely little chat with your brother the other day, you see, and realization struck Violet. She tried to yank her hand away, but found it held fast in a surprisingly strong grip. You're Rita Skeeter, Violet said accusatorily. Rita Skeeter's smile widened. Violet counted 3 gold teeth. Smile for the camera, darling. There was sudden flash of light, and Violet thought she'd been blinded. Blinking rapidly, it took a few moments for her vision to return, and even then it was marred by pulsing spots of yellow and black. A man was now standing by their table, holding an old-fashioned black camera which was smoking slightly. Rita Skeeter had finally let go of her hand, though, and had produced a roll of parchment, which she spread out on the table between them, and a long acid-green quill. You won't mind, Violet, if I use a quick quotes quill. It leaves me free to talk to you normally. That quill, which quivered with a life of its own in Rita Skeeter's taloned fingers, was likely responsible for all of the ridiculous things Harry had said in his horrible interview. I don't want to talk to you, Violet said firmly. Rita Skeeter's gilded smile didn't falter. She was likely used to hearing this and didn't look as though she meant to pay it any mind. How do you feel about your little brother being made champion, Violet? Asked Rita Skeeter around the tip of the acid-green quill, which she sucked for a moment with apparent relish before putting it to parchment. It stood upright on the page, balanced on its point for a moment, and then began to write, skidding quickly across the parchment. A pretty face covering the grief of a tragic past, young Violet Potter, whose eyes stopped that. I said I don't want to talk to you, Violet said more angrily. A flicker of annoyance crossed Rita Skeeter's heavily powdered face. Now, Violet dear, I know you must be terribly worried about Harry's fate in the coming challenges. Only a few days away now, tell me, are you nervous? Proud of him for breaking the rules and putting himself in such danger. Leave me alone, said Violet stubbornly. The green quill was still whizzing across the page, even though she was doing her best to give it nothing to work with. What do you think drove Harry to do something like this? Rita Skeeter pressed, ignoring her completely. Don't you think he's been the source of enough controversy? Does he often go out of his way to make trouble, as a way to seek the attention the two of you could never get from your parents? Violet ignored Rita Skeeter right back and squinted at the upside-down words the quick quotes quill was currently writing. My brother, Harry, has always needed more validation than I could give him, said Violet Potter, with tears filling those startlingly green eyes as our conversation turns to, I never said any of that, said Violet angrily. Before Rita Skeeter could say another word, there was a very loud oops from behind her, and the next moment a wave of golden liquid came pouring over the top of her head. It drenched her horrible rigid curls and dripped onto the parchment, ruining the ink and sending the green quill racing for cover. Rita Skeeter shrieked loudly and jumped to her feet. Behind her stood Tracy Davis, holding 2 glasses. One was full of butterbeer, and the other was completely empty. Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am, Tracy simpered loudly, brown eyes wide with feigned innocence. I must have tripped on your handbag. Rita Skeeter looked livid, though it was a little difficult to tell. Her heavily penciled eyebrows had begun to run. Why, you rotten, stupid little. Conversation in the pub had stuttered to a halt as patrons were turning toward the source of the commotion. Even the pretty landlady, Madame Rosmeter, had stopped in the middle of the room with a tray full of drinks to stare at Tracy and Rita Skeeter. The cameraman raised his camera eagerly, but Rita Skeeter shot him such a withering, warning look that he lowered it again immediately. Lovely, she said acidly, shaking her ruined curls out of her face. We'll just have to pick this up later, won't we? With one last vicious smile in Violet's direction, Rita Skeeter swept her soggy parchment and quill off the table and stomped her way out of the 3 broomsticks. Once the ringing of the slammed door had faded behind her, talk went back to normal. Tracy set the full glass of butterbeer down in front of Violet and sat delicately in the seat that Rita Skeeter had just vacated. With a casual wave of her wand, she vanished the remains of the spilt drink. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Tracy said lightly, still wearing the look of supreme innocence. Violet could have kissed her all over again. "Thank you," she said breathlessly, staring at Tracy in admiration. "I thought she'd never leave me alone." "I can't believe she had the nerve to come up to you like that. After all that nonsense she printed about Harry, she couldn't actually think you'd want to talk to her." "She didn't seem to care very much about what I wanted at all," muttered Violet with a grimace. "Really though, thank you for getting rid of her, and for ruining her notes. That horrible quill wasn't even twisting my words, it was just making them up entirely." "It was my genuine pleasure," Tracy said with a bright, straight smile. There was another flurry of cold air through the pub as the door opened once more, and in stepped Hermione Granger, apparently all by herself. Violet caught her eye and waved her over, and watched with growing suspicion as Hermione edged slowly through the crowd, moving as though she was trying to keep an extra foot of space behind herself. Violet's suspicions were confirmed when, though Hermione took the seat to her left, the empty chair to her right slowly pulled itself out from the table as well. "Hi, Hermione," Violet said, and then quietly added, "Hello, Harry." "How'd you know I was here?" whispered her brother's mildly annoyed-sounding voice, seemingly from thin air. "Because you two move really awkwardly when only one of you is invisible." "I told you I looked ridiculous," Hermione hissed as she pulled a thick Muggle notebook out of her bag. She frowned and looked under the table. "Why is the floor all sticky here?" "Oh no, I must have missed a spot," Tracy said, pulling out her wand once more. "Sorry, I spilled some butterbeer earlier, right over Rita Skeeter's head," Violet said, grinning. Hermione gasped. "Is that what happened to her?" "We just saw her outside," she looked furious. "What was she even doing here anyways?" Tracy asked. "I reckon she's staying in the village, waiting to watch the first task," said Harry's voice, sounding miserable. Violet glanced evenly in his direction, though she couldn't see him at all, and said, "How are you feeling about the first task, Harry? Have you prepared for it at all?" "How am I meant to prepare for something when I don't even know what it is?" Harry groaned. "What about Warrington? What's he been doing to get ready for it?" "Cassis doing a lot of reading, as far as I know," Violet said stiffly. "He hasn't really been talking to me much lately." "Why not?" asked Harry in surprise. "I thought you two were, best mates." "So did I," Violet muttered, echoing his words about Ron. She took a deep sip of her butterbeer. "We're all still friends," said Tracy hastily, looking hopefully at Violet, "but things are just, well, they're complicated right now." Cass was really excited about being named champion, and I think he thought more people would be excited for him, too. But then that article came out, and he was really hurt not to be mentioned in it at all, not even at the end when that Skeeter woman mentioned the others. And it's all anyone's been talking about lately, so it's not like he can just block it out. "What, so he's mad at Violet because Rita Skeeter wrote a load of lies about me?" said Harry's voice angrily. "How does that make any sense?" "I don't think he's mad at Roman 6, not really. She always stands up for you, Harry, you know that. I think Cass was hoping she might stand up for him a bit too." "I'll stand up for him when he stops being such an ass about things," Violet said hotly. "Mind your language, girl," said a gruff voice from behind her. Violet jumped badly and whipped around. Professor Moody was standing there, a grin stretching his lopsided mouth. Beside him, beaming down at them all, was Hagrid. "All right, girls," said Hagrid loudly. "Hello," said Hermione, smiling back. Moody limped around the table and bent down. Violet thought he was reading Hermione's notebook until he muttered, "Nice cloak, Potter." Violet's eyes went wide. From the empty seat next to her, Harry's voice whispered, "Can your I mean, can you?" "Yeah, it can see through invisibility cloaks," Moody said quietly. "And it's come in useful at times, I can tell you." Hagrid was beaming down at Harry's chair too. Though he obviously couldn't see Harry, Moody must have told him he was there. Hagrid now bent down on the pretext of reading Hermione's notebook as well, and whispered something so low that only Harry could hear it. Then he straightened up and said loudly, "Nice to see ye, girls," winked and departed. Moody followed him. "What did Hagrid say?" Violet asked, as soon as the pub door had closed again. "He wants me to meet him at midnight," Harry said, sounding very surprised. "And to bring the cloak. What for?" "I dunno. I've never visited him that late before. Can I come with you?" The hesitation was plain in Harry's voice. Violet was certain he was going to tell her off until he said, "Yeah, actually. I dunno how I feel about going alone." "And I suppose it's best if it's you, right?" Violet beamed at Harry's empty chair. At 11:30 that evening, Violet, who had pretended to go to bed early, pulled the leather cord she wore around her neck over her head and slipped free the silver ring that hung from it. It was a beautiful ring, set with 3 small, milk-white stones, and it had been given to her for her very first Christmas at Hogwarts. Just as Harry's invisibility cloak had once belonged to their father, Violet's ring was once in the possession of their mother. It didn't make the wearer invisible, however. When Violet slipped the ring onto her finger, her whole entire body became shimmery and translucent, just like the many ghosts that haunted Hogwarts halls. Also like a ghost, in her translucent state, Violet was able to move through solid objects like walls and doors, and even other people, passing through the door of the common room as easily as if it weren't there at all. Violet kept to the shadows, half in and half out of the stone walls, until she made it to the broom cupboard in the entrance hall. It was the same cupboard that she and Hermione had hidden in the year before during their brief adventures with time travel, and Violet waited anxiously for Harry's soft knock on the door. When it arrived, she slipped the ring off and joined her brother beneath the invisibility cloak, and the two of them set off out of the castle. The grounds were very dark. Harry and Violet walked down the lawn toward the lights shining in Hagrid's cabin. The inside of the enormous Beauxbatons carriage was also lit up. They could hear Madame Maxime talking inside it as Harry knocked on Hagrid's front door. "You there, Harry?" Hagrid whispered, "Open the door thee," and looking around. "Yeah," said Harry, slipping inside the cabin and pulling the cloak down off of them both. Violet waved nervously as Hagrid beamed down at her. "Good, good, glad to see ye, Violet. I was hopping Harry'd bring you along. Got summat to show ye." There was an air of enormous excitement about Hagrid. He was wearing a flower that resembles an oversized artichoke in his buttonhole. It looked as though he had made an attempt at combing his hair. Violet could see the comb's broken teeth tangled in it. "Hagrid, come here," Violet said, beckoning him down to her level. Hagrid bent down so that she could reach his head, though she still had to stand on tiptoes to do so, and did her best to pick the bits of wood out of his thick, wiry hair while he and Harry talked. "What are you showing us?" Harry said warily. He had a right to be nervous. This level of excitement from Hagrid likely meant it was going to be something a normal person would find strange or horrifying. "Ye'll see when we get there, but ye've got to keep quiet and keep yourselves covered with that cloak," said Hagrid. "We won't take Fang, he won't like it." "What are you all dressed up for?" Violet asked suspiciously, nodding at the flower as Hagrid straightened up. His great face reddened beneath his beard. "Nothing," he said evasively. "A fella can dress hisself up once in a while, can he?" "I suppose," but Hagrid wasn't listening. He was opening the cabin door and striding off into the night. Harry threw the cloak over them, both, and they hurried to follow and found, to their great surprise, that Hagrid was leading them to the Beauxbatons' carriage. "Hagrid, what shhh?" said Hagrid, and he knocked 3 times on the door bearing the crossed golden wands. Madame Maxime opened it. She was wearing a silk shawl wrapped around her massive shoulders. She smiled when she saw Hagrid, and the sight of her took Violet's breath away. "Ah, Hagrid, it is time." "Bonsoir," said Hagrid, beaming at her and holding out a hand to help her down the golden steps. Madame Maxim closed the door behind her. Hagrid offered his arm, and they set off around the edge of the paddock containing Madame Maxim's Abraxans, the giant winged horses that pulled the massive carriage. Looking between the pair of them, Violet was now beginning to understand Hagrid's bizarre attempt at styling himself. It seemed that Madame Maxime was in for the same treat as the twins, because after a while she said playfully, "Where is it you are taking me, Hagrid?" "Ye'll enjoy this," said Hagrid gruffly. "Worth seeing, trust me. Ani darn, go tellin' anyone I showed ye right. Ye're not s'posed to know." "Of course not," said Madame Maxim, fluttering her long black eyelashes. And still they walked, Harry and Violet getting more and more breathless as they jogged along in their wake, struggling to keep up without revealing themselves. Hagrid was clearly taking his time with this little moonlit stroll, and kept glancing at Madame Maxime with a smitten smile on his ruddy face. But then, when they had walked so far around the perimeter of the forest that the castle and the lake were out of sight, Violet heard something. Men were shouting up ahead. Then came a deafening, ear-splitting roar. Hagrid led Madame Maxime around a clump of trees and came to a halt. Harry and Violet hurried up alongside them for a split second, Violet though she was seeing bonfires, and men darting around them, and then her mouth fell open. Dragons. 4 fully grown, enormous, vicious-looking dragons were rearing onto their hind legs inside an enclosed fence with thick planks of wood. Roaring and snorting torrents of fire were shooting into the dark sky from their open, fanged mouths, 50 feet above the ground on their outstretched necks. There was a silvery blue one with long, pointed horns, snapping and snarling at the wizards on the ground. A smooth-scaled green one, which was writhing and stamping with all its might. A red one with an odd fringe of fine gold spikes around its face, which was shooting mushroom-shaped fire clouds into the air. And a gigantic black one, more lizard-like than the others, which was nearest to them. At least 30 wizards, 7 or 8 to each dragon, were attempting to control them, pulling on the chains connected to heavy leather straps around their necks and legs. Mesmerized, Violet looked up, high above her, and saw the eyes of the black dragon, with vertical pupils like a cat, bulging with either fear or rage. She couldn't tell which. It was making a horrible noise, a yowling, screeching scream. "Keep back there, Hagrid," yelled a wizard near the fence, straining on the chain he was holding. "They can shoot fire at a range of 20 feet, you know. I've seen this horntail do 40. "Isn't it beautiful?" said Hagrid softly. "It's no good," yelled another wizard. Stunning spells, on the count of 3. Violet saw each of the dragon keepers pull out their wands. "Stupefy," they shouted in unison, and the stunning spells shot into the darkness like fiery rockets, bursting in showers of stars on the dragon's scaly hides. Violet watched the dragon nearest to them teeter dangerously on its back legs, its jaw stretched wide in a silent howl. Its nostrils were suddenly devoid of flame, though still smoking. Then, very slowly it fell. Several tons of sinewy, scaly black dragon hit the ground with a thud that Violet could have sworn made the trees behind her quake. The dragon keepers lowered their wands and walked forward to their fallen charges, each of which was the size of a small hill. They hurried to tighten the chains and fasten them securely to iron pegs, which they forced deep into the ground with their wands. "One, a closer look," Hagrid asked Madame Maxime excitedly. The pair of them moved right up to the fence, and Harry and Violet followed. The wizard who had warned Hagrid not to come any closer turned, and Violet realized who it was, Charlie Weasley. "All right, Hagrid," he panted, coming over to talk. "They should be okay now. We put them out with a sleeping draft on the way here. Thought it might be better for them to wake up in the dark and quiet, but like you saw, they weren't happy, not happy at all." "What breeds you got here, Charlie?" said Hagrid, gazing at the closest dragon, the black one, with something close to reverence. Its eyes were still just open. Violet could see a strip of gleaming yellow beneath its wrinkled black eyelid. "This is a Hungarian horntail," said Charlie. "There's a common Welsh green over there, the smaller one a Swedish short snout, that blue-gray and a Chinese fireball, that's the red." Charlie looked around. Madame Maxime was strolling away around the edge of the enclosure, gazing at the stunned dragons. "I didn't know you were bringing her, Hagrid," Charlie said, frowning. The champions aren't supposed to know what's coming. She's bound to tell her student, isn't she? Zeus thought she'd like to see 'em, shrugged Hagrid, still gazing enraptured at the dragons. Really romantic date, Hagrid, said Charlie, shaking his head. "4," said Hagrid. "So it's on Furicho, the champions, is it? What have they gotta do fight 'em?" "Just get past them, I think," said Charlie. "We'll be on hand if it gets nasty, extinguishing spells at the ready." They wanted nesting mothers, I don't know why. But I tell you this, I don't envy the one who gets the horntail. Vicious thing. Its back end's as dangerous as its front. Look. Charlie pointed toward the horntail's tail, and Violet saw long, bronze-colored spikes protruding along it every few inches. 5 of Charlie's fellow keepers staggered up to the horntail at that moment, carrying a clutch of huge granite-gray eggs between them in a blanket. They placed them carefully at the horntail's side. Hagrid let out a moan of longing. "I've got them counted, Hagrid," said Charlie sternly. Then he said, "How's Harry?" "Fine," said Hagrid. He was still gazing at the eggs. "Just hope he's still fine after he's faced this lot," said Charlie grimly, looking out over the dragon's enclosure. "I didn't dare tell Mum what he's got to do for the first task. She's already having kittens about him." Charlie imitated his mother's anxious voice. "How could they let him enter that tournament? He's much too young." "I thought they were all safe, although there was going to be an age limit. She was in floods after that Daily Prophet article about him. He still cries about his parents. Oh, bless him, I never knew." Harry had clearly had enough. Violet would have loved to stand around and study the dragon some more, but Harry took her hand beneath the cloak and gave a firm tug, pulling her away from the enclosure and back toward the castle. "Dragons," Violet said breathlessly when they were a safe distance away from Hagrid and Madame Maxim. "They're going to make you fight a dragon." "Just get past it," Charlie said. Harry mumbled. His face had gone ashen. "But still, that's... Are you all right?" "We can stop for a moment if I'm fine," Harry said, marching resolutely on. "I've seen them, the shock's over now, and I know what's coming. So all I've got to do is get past a dragon somehow, in front of the whole school in 3 days. I can," he gulped audibly. "I can do that, Harry." Harry sped up, forcing Violet to keep pace with him or risk slipping out from beneath the cloak. They skirted the edge of the forest. It was fairly to retrace their footsteps, even in the darkness, and they were almost in sight of the castle again when Violet saw a shadow slip between the trees again. She grabbed the back of Harry's shirt and dragged him to a halt, just in time. The dark outline of a man had just come around the tree in front of them, and they would have walked straight into him if they hadn't stopped. Violet recognized the goatee. It was Karkaroff. The twins remained still and silent as Karkaroff passed within inches of their invisible bodies, disappearing off through the cover of the trees, edging toward the place where the dragons were. "What's he doing out here in the dark?" Harry breathed, staring into the brush that Karkaroff had disappeared through. "Same thing as us," Violet murmured back. "I'll bet he followed Hagrid and Madame Maxime heading into the forest. They're not hard to spot. But that means he'll find the dragons, too. So everybody will know about them then," said Violet, as the two of them reached the castle doors. The two of them slipped quickly inside and headed over to the staircase when led down into the dungeons. Still under the cover of the cloak, Violet slipped the ring back onto her finger and became insubstantial once more. "Are you going to tell Warrington?" Harry asked suddenly before she could slip away down the steps. "Of course," said Violet at once. "Unless you're planning to, that is." Well, I would, only I'll take care of it," Violet told him. "Don't worry about it, not when you've got other things to be worrying about." Harry gave her a slightly queasy smile. Violet started to give him a quick hug, then remembered that she would pass right through him if she tried, and instead darted out from the beneath the cloak without another word. Chapter 16. The First Task. Violet got up on Sunday morning and dressed so inattentively that she nearly walked out of the dormitory with only one side of her hair braided and the other left poofing out, untamed. When she finally got herself looking presentable, she hurried off to find Tracy, locating her at the Slytherin table in the Great Hall, where she was eating breakfast alone. "I need to tell you something. It's really important," Violet started, but broke off when she saw the look of abject misery on Tracy's face. "What's the matter?" Wordlessly, which was very unlike her indeed, Tracy pushed what looked like a crumpled, wadded-up mess of parchment across the table. After a few moments of careful unfolding, Violet recognized it to be a copy of Thedily Prophet. Smoothing the paper out on the table, she began to look for the source of Tracy's upset. It didn't take very long to find. While it didn't take up the whole front page, as Harry's had, Rita Skeeter's article about Violet was impossible to miss. Just as the most poisonous berries bear the most inviting appearances, so does young Violet Potter. A stunningly lovely face just barely manages to cover the wickedness that lurks within. "What?" Violet looked at Tracy in bewilderment, but only got a mournful glare in response. She kept reading. In stark contrast to her sweet, sensitive little brother, Harry, Violet Potter is a known danger within the hallowed halls of Hogwarts School. Her prodigious temper is known to flare at even the slightest provocation, sending older and younger students alike running for cover. Pansy Parkington, a girl in the same year as Violet, reports that she rules their shared dormitory with an iron fist, with the aid of Tracy Davies, her hefty and brutish bodyguard. "We're all terrified of them," Parkington said, looking nervously over her shoulder as we spoke in confidence. "I've been attacked loads of times, just for trying to stand up to them, and Violet was laughing too hard to be able to keep reading. This is ridiculous," she gasped, pushing the paper back at Tracy. "Can you believe the nerve of her?" But Tracy didn't look at all amused. Violet's laughter trailed off. She coughed awkwardly. "What's wrong?" she asked again. "You know it's all lies, Trace. Did you see what she called me?" Tracy muttered. Violet glanced quickly back at the paper. "What, my bodyguard?" Tracy sighed deeply. "Yeah, Romans 6. Your hefty, brutish bodyguard," she said with a pained grimace. "And I suppose that's how people like her and Pansy would see me, wouldn't they?" Tracy's hands were on the table in front of her, her thick fingers clasped tightly together. Violet frowned, trying to puzzle out what exactly the problem was. "Who cares what they think about you?" she said, twining a comforting arm with Tracy's own. "Pansy isn't worth half of you, you know that." But apparently this was the wrong thing to say, because Tracy shrugged Violet off and pulled away. "You don't have to rub it in, Violet. I know what I look like." Now Violet was truly baffled. "What you look like? What's that supposed to mean?" "What's wrong with what you look like?" "Well, I don't look like you, for starts," Tracy snapped. "Miss Stunningly Lovely never found a dress you couldn't wear, skin and bones Violet. How could I look like anything but a hulking brute when standing next to you?" "What are you talking about?" Violet said, stunned. "What's how I look got anything to do with how you look? I don't under—" "Of course you don't understand," Tracy exploded. "How could possibly understand what it's like?" What's like?" "Being fat." Violet's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Tracy was properly glaring at her now, angry tears gathering in the corners of her brown eyes. She looked away quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Violet had never heard her speak like this before, about herself or anyone else. It was true that Tracy was on the heavy side, with soft, chubby cheeks and a rather rounded figure, but that had been true since the very first day they met. There wasn't anything odd or unpleasant about how Tracy looked in Violet's eyes, but apparently Tracy had a very different opinion. "Of course you don't look like me," Violet said gently, though she wasn't sure if she was meant to be saying anything at all. "You look like you, and I happen to think you're perfect the way you are." "That's very kind of you, Violet," Tracy muttered, still not looking at her, "but I think that's still just you." She sniffed and rubbed her eyes again. "I shouldn't have said anything. I just didn't know you felt that way." "Well, you wouldn't, would you? I mean, just never mind, all right. I know I'm being stupid." Violet felt quite awkward. She very badly wanted to help and to reassure her friend, but none of the words in her head sounded like the right thing to say. She wisely supposed that it wouldn't be right to mention that the only reason she was as skinny as she was in the first place, was because she'd been starved all through her childhood. That would only be the start of another, even worse conversation. They ate in silence for several minutes. Tracy merely pushed her food around the plate, never taking an actual bite, before the silence was finally broken by Tracy taking a deep breath and asking, "So, what were you going to tell me?" When you came in, you said you have something important to tell me." "Oh," Violet said. She chewed her jam and toast slowly, thinking hard about what it could have been that she wanted to say. And then Hagrid sidled into his seat at the end of the high table, and she remembered. Oh, right. Do you mind if we go somewhere else, actually? It's supposed to be a secret." Pushing her plate away without ceremony, Tracy nodded and climbed to her feet. The two of them headed out of the great hall in silence, Violet brainstorming where exactly they could go and talk in private, when the door swung open just as they reached it. Cass checked himself just before they all ran into each other. "Oh," he said, blinking down at Violet. "There you are." Violet blinked right back and said, "Here I am." Cass didn't move. She noticed he was clutching a copy of the day's paper in his hand. He followed her gaze and looked down at it and then back at her. "I've been an idiot," he said abruptly. Violet raised an eyebrow. "You reckon?" Cass's cheeks went pink. He at least had the decency to look properly abashed. "Yeah, I do," he said. "I only just finished reading this, and I knew I had to come and find you and say I was sorry for acting like a prick and for saying what I did about your brother." Violet crossed her arms over her chest and waited. Cass took a deep breath and ran his fingers awkwardly through his hair. "So, I'm sorry," he said finally, with a resolute set to his chin. "I'm sorry for my behavior and for hurting your feelings, and I swear I won't do it again." "What made you come to your senses?" Violet asked, squinting suspiciously at him. Cass held up the copy of Thedily Prophet. "I got this," he said, and realized that if she could lie and print a load of rubbish about the best people I know, then there's nothing that she could say about me that I'd want other people to hear. Which I realize now that I've said it out loud is very self-centered and probably not the sort of answer you were looking for. But that's the best I've got. Also, I really miss the pair of you because it turns out that everyone else is really annoying all of the time." Violet pursed her lips together to stop from smiling. She didn't do a very good job of it. Cassius started to look a bit more hopeful. "So," he said tentatively. Is that good enough?" Tracy and Violet shared a look, as though they were pretending to consider something between themselves. Then they nodded. "Apology accepted," Violet said. His face crumpled into an expression of relief, which quickly became confusion as Violet put a hand on his shoulder and lightly shoved him out of the doorway. "Come on, I've got something to tell you both. But breakfast, trust me, this is more important." Without another word, the three of them hurried to the library, where they found a quiet corner with a table they could huddle around. There, Violet told them both everything she and Harry had seen the night before. Cass went pale at the mere mention of dragons, and got steadily whiter as Violet went into detail about the 4 different species she had seen. "I thought it was supposed to be less dangerous this year," he mumbled numbly, staring down at the table in front of him. "How do they expect us to fight a dragon?" "Not fight, just get past it," Violet said quickly. "I don't know if there's going to be more to it, but I think the dragons might just be guarding something. If you can just sneak past it or distract it somehow." "You said Theranisting mothers, Violet." "How am I meant to get a dragon mum away from her dragon kids?" "Make it look like you aren't a threat," Tracy offered uncertainly. Or make sure there's something that's more of a threat than you and rush in while she deals with it." "That's brilliant," said Cass, staring at her. "That's actually really brilliant, Tracy, and it's something I could probably do too. I'm not bad at transfiguration. Could you transfigure the dragon itself?" Violet said eagerly. "Make it into a bunny rabbit or something harmless." Cass shook his head at once. "I said I'm not bad at transfiguration, but I'm not McGonagall. I don't know if even she would able to turn a whole dragon into something else, honestly. But please don't tell her I said that." She might prove me wrong by transfiguring my desk or something. The three of them spent the rest of the day in the library, pulling down every book they could find on advanced transfiguration spells. Cass was going to need to practice, but he was determined to learn the theory of it first before getting any wand work involved. And they weren't the only ones looking for solutions in the library. Harry and Hermione wandered in around lunchtime, looking very deep in conversation. Harry told Violet that he had written Sirius early that morning and was hoping to hear back by that night. For now, Hermione was having him study the dragons themselves for any places of weakness. But the two of them didn't stay for very long. Apparently, their was was something capable of driving Hermione Granger out of the library, and that something came in the form of the Durmstrang champion. As soon as Victor Crumb slouched in and settled himself in a distant corner, Hermione and Harry packed up and headed for the Gryffindor common room. The next morning Violet awoke, feeling more confident than she had in weeks. She was back on speaking terms with all of the people she cared about, and they were on track to tackle the known challenges to come. Things were back to the way they ought to be. Whatever effect Rita Skeeter had hoped to have with that horrible article had backfired. As anyone who'd ever been in a room with Violet could attest, she was about as monstrous as a flabberworm, and was more likely to burst into tears on someone than to go flying at them with fists and claws, unless that someone happened to be Draco Malfoy. But even that was a source of amusement among their fellow Slytherins. Been beaten up by any little girls lately, Malfoy? You'd better be nice to me, or I'll set Potter on you. Draco, look out, she's right behind you. The only people who seemed to take the article seriously at all were the first years, who went wide-eyed at the sight of Violet in the hallways and tripped over their own feet trying to get out of her way. It was very funny at first, but the humor wore off around noon. Violet and Tracy didn't have lunch, but instead met Cass in a free classroom, where they watched him practice increasingly complicated feats of transfiguration. While he had nothing larger than a desk to practice on, both girls were very impressed when he managed to transfigure it into a live wolf, which growled and snapped at them until Cass hastily turned it back. "You're really good at this," Tracy cheered. "I remember when you had trouble turning a teapot into a tortoise. Now look at you." "It got easier when I actually started thinking about the formula," Cassius said, using the sleeve of his robe to wipe the sweat from his brow. "McGonagall drilled it into us that it's not enough to know what you're trying to do, you've got to understand it. She said it's like science. Is that the word?" "Oh my God," Tracy said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Wizards are so stupid sometimes, I swear." It was 20 minutes before everyone had calmed down enough to start practicing again. When Tuesday arrived, all the anxiety that Violet had been repressing returned in full force. She awoke in darkness and lay flat on her back in bed, paralyzed with nerves for what she knew would be happening today. Her brother and her best friend were going to be fighting dragons, and there was nothing more she could do to help them. It wasn't that she was unable over the years. Violet had committed some truly remarkable feats of wandless magic when she was under stress, and this absolutely counted as a stressful situation. But that couldn't happen today. This wasn't a chaotic life-or-death struggle like she'd been through last year. This was a tournament. There were rules, and there would be judges and people watching very closely to make sure that everybody was following those rules. The last thing Violet wanted to do was interfere and end up getting Harry or Cassius disqualified. She panicked all through her morning lessons and didn't remember walking down to lunch at all. Across the room at the Gryffindor table, Violet watched her brother try and fail 3 separate times to guide a fork into his own mouth, so distracted he was by staring into the distance. Cass, too, was having trouble eating. He kept cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces until his plate was full of an unrecognizable mash. And then Professor McGonagall was beckoning to him across the way, and he and Harry were led swiftly from the great hall. "They'll be fine," Tracy reassured her, though she looked just as nervous as Violet felt. As lunch ended, the teachers and prefects herded the students out onto the grounds to attend the first task. Violet was surprised to see Professor Lupin shepherding first years along near the front. It was the day after the full moon after all, and he usually spent it recovering from his transformation. But even as pale and exhausted as he looked, Violet supposed he would want to be there for Harry. They were led toward the place where the dragons were, around the edge of the forest. But when they approached the clump of trees, behind which the enclosure would be clearly visible, Violet saw that a tent had been erected, its entrance facing them, though closed, screening the dragons from view. Cass and Harry were probably in there with the other champions, preparing for the trial to come. The dragon's enclosure had been reinforced since the last time Violet had been there. There were no longer any gaps in the fence, and several rows of stands had been magicked around it, looking down into the rocky pit below. No dragons were visible yet. As Violet and Tracy looked around for good seats, a flurry of motion from the very front row caught her attention. Sirius Black was waving pointedly at her. She grabbed Tracy by the hand and hurried over. "What are you doing here?" Violet asked, stunned, as she allowed herself to be pulled into Sirius' warm hug. "Supporting my godson," said Sirius loudly, standing back to beam at her. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" "And who is this?" "This is Tracy Davis," Violet said, pulling a wide-eyed Tracy forward to shake Sirius' hand. "She's my best friend." "Ah, the bodyguard," Sirius said with a grin. "From the way our dear Rita described you, I was expecting to meet another Hagrid." His words were clearly in jest, but he must have seen the way Tracy's face fell, because he leaned in and added, "Never mind what that bitter old shrew has to say about you. If she wants to meet a brute, all she needs is for someone to hold up a mirror." From the sound of things, Violet couldn't have asked for a better friend. When he straightened up, smiling encouragingly, Tracy's cheeks had flushed a darker shade than usual, and she too was smiling back at him. Thank you, sir." "Sirius, please," he said quickly. He scooted down the bench seat to make room for the girls to join him, which they did. "Being Khalid, makes me feel like a stodgy old man. Speak of the devil." Violet looked round in time to see Professor Lupin picking his way through the stands toward them. He greeted Sirius with a friendly nod and took the empty seat to Tracy's left, wincing slightly as he sat down. "How are you feeling?" Violet asked at once, looking carefully at him now that he was so close. The dark circles under his eyes, coupled with the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, gave him a slightly harrowed appearance, but he otherwise looked unharmed. "I'm fine, thank you, Violet," Lupin replied, inclining his head slightly. "I feel I should be asking you that as well. We haven't had a chance to speak, but I saw the article. Have people been giving you any trouble?" Violet grinned. "Not hardly," she told him. "I think most people have seen me crying too often to be scared of me." The corners of Professor Lupin's eyes crinkled warmly as he smiled, but the weariness in them was still plain to see. "Harry told you what he's facing, didn't he?" Violet asked quietly, looking at Sirius. He nodded, frowning. "Oh yes, his letter was most descriptive. I gave him a few pointers. I know he'll do fine, so long as he keeps his head." "What exactly is Harry meant to be up against?" asked Professor Lupin sharply. Sirius let out a bark of laughter. "You don't know?" "Well, let's not spoil the surprise then, eh?" He nudged Violet with his elbow, grinning. Violet shrugged apologetically toward Lupin's suspicious face. As the rest of the crowd settled into their seats, the chatter quieted to a low hum of anticipation. The judges had been set up on one side of the pit 5 raised seats, draped in gold. Mr. Crouch sat in the rightmost seat, and a sudden hush fell over the crowd as he rose to his feet. Violet saw him place his wand to his throat, just as Mr. Bagman had done at the World Cup, and Mr. Crouch's magically magnified voice boomed across the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and staff, it is my duty to welcome you to our revival of the Triwizard Tournament," he called stiffly. A few cheers went up, but trailed off without enthusiasm. "As their first task, our champions will be tested on their bravery, daring, and speed as they face an unknown danger. They will deal with this challenge alone and be judged separately. On my whistle, we will begin." He withdrew a silver whistle from his pocket and gave it a single short, sharp blast. Opposite the judges, a large section of wall had opened up. There was a moment of tense, excited silence, and then as one the crowd gasped as the massive, scaly form of a dragon came fully into view. Professor Lupin swore beneath his breath and sat forward in his seat. It was the attractive silver blue that Violet had seen a few nights before, the one Charlie had called a Swedish short-snort. Intimidating as it had looked at night, bathed in the fire and wan light of its fellow dragons and handlers, it looked even fiercer now that she could see it in daylight. The sun gleamed off its scales, and its bright blue eyes were rolling wildly as it took in the crowd high above it. Students in the front rows, closest to the pit, were now scrambling to get further back. The gate shut quickly behind the dragon as soon as it was through. Now free of its handlers, the dragon scanned the enclosure and headed straight toward the middle. Violet hadn't noticed it before, but there was some sort of nest set up, with about a dozen glittering grey eggs arranged within. One egg, however, looked to be made of solid gold. There was another whistle blast. A flap opened in the wall of the enclosure, and a very green-looking Cassius Warrington emerged into the pit. No one in the crowd was cheering louder than Tracy and Violet. The applause was thunderous, and the dragon threw its head back at the sudden noise. Cheers became screams as a jet of a blue fire spurted into the air. Violet's stomach lurched dangerously. "Come on, Cass," she muttered, holding tightly to Tracy's hand as they watched Cass creep forward, keeping his eyes fixed on the dragon. "Come on, just like we practiced." "Another friend of yours?" Sirius asked, shifting in his seat to speak to Violet without being overheard. She nodded without taking her eyes off of Cass. "What's his name? I didn't quite catch it." "Cass," Violet said automatically. "Cassius Warrington." "Ah, Warrington." Violet was too distracted to ask Sirius what he meant by that, or to turn and see the look on his face. The dragon had just spotted the intruder into its enclosure. It lowered its body closer to the ground, eyes fixed on the potential threat. Below, Cass raised his wand and aimed it, not at the dragon, but at a large boulder set to the side. It looked deliberately placed, and was likely meant to provide the champions some cover should they need it. But when Cass shouted an incantation, there was a flash of light, and a moment later the boulder had vanished. In its place, its many legs covered in thick black hair, stood the biggest spider that Violet had ever seen in her life. Several people, including Tracy, screamed. Even Cass himself hastily backed away, taking refuge behind another sizable rock, while the spider scuttled in place, looking around at all of them. Its pincers chattered horribly when it caught sight of the dragon. An alternating chorus of shrieks and cheers echoed across the makeshift stadium as the spider and dragon slowly began to circle one another, clearly sizing each other up. The spider, though large by spider standards, was roughly only a quarter of the dragon's size and seemed reluctant to give any ground. It clacked and chittered, numerous eyes flashing in the sunlight. It opened its pincers threateningly at the great beast before it. All the while, Cassius was darting from rock to rock, staying low and out of the dragon's sight. He'd managed to sneak halfway across the pit when the spider finally lunged. It was only a feint, but it seemed enough to test the dragon's patience. "Oh, he's clever," Sirius cheered, eagerly sitting forward in his seat. Blue-gray smoke was billowing from the dragon's snout. Its pupils were narrowed to dangerous slits as it advanced on the spider, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the earth as it took 2 threatening steps forward. This was the opening Cass needed. As the dragon's mouth opened wide, twin jets of blue flame shooting across the pit to engulf the spider. Cass lunged out from his hiding place and sprinted forward, but the flash of movement caught the dragon's attention. Cheers turned to screams as the dragon's head turned suddenly and the blue flames passed over where Cass had stood a moment before. Violet leapt to her feet, petrified, hands pulling at her own hair as she waited for the flames to stop. Certain she was going to see nothing left but her friend's charred, blackened remains. But then the cheering started up again, and Cass was clambering to his feet near the dragon's tail, smoking faintly but alive. Under one arm, nestled like a quaffle against his chest, was the golden egg. "He's done it!" Tracy shrieked, jumping up and down in excitement. "He's got the egg, he's got it." A loud whistle sounded, and a group of dragon handlers rushed in to deal with the Swedish short snout, guiding it out the enclosure through the way it had come in. Cass was hastily led off by two mediwizards, and the field was reset. "Now for the scores," shouted the voice of Ludo Bagman, who Violet only just now realized was commentating. She'd been so focused on the action that she hadn't heard a word he'd been saying. But Bagman didn't announce the scores, as she'd expected. All eyes turned to the judges' table as the five officials raised their wands one by one and cast what looked like long, silver ribbons shot into the air, twisting themselves into numbers. Madame Maxime gave Cassius an 8, and the crowd burst into applause. Mr. Crouch came next, and he too offered an 8. Next, Dumbledore, who put up a 9, setting the crowd roaring with excitement. But then came Ludo Bagman's 7. "What's that for?" hollered a Slytherin 7th year a few seats away from Violet and Tracy. The rest of the crowd seemed equally displeased. When Professor Karkaroff raised his wand and produced a 6, some of the Slytherins seemed ready to riot. "That's bollocks," shouted Graham Montague, standing on his seat with both hands cupped around his mouth. "Let's see your bloke do better, eh?" But the crowd would have to wait yet to see how Victor Crumb would handle his dragon. Once the field had been reset, and the next dragon was led into the pit, the common Welsh Green, who seemed more distracted by all the noise than angry, the door in the side of the enclosure opened once more, and out stepped Fleur de Lacre, the Beauxbatons champion. There was a great deal of cheering just at the sight of her. Even at this distance, her beauty was magnetic. Violet swiftly averted her eyes. Maybe if she only kept Fleur in her periphery, rather than looking directly at her, whatever effect the other girl had on her wouldn't be able to take hold. This was a solid idea, though in vain, for instead of creeping around the field and ducking behind rocks as Cassius had done, Fleur stayed out in the open and walked straight up to the dragon, which eyed her warily, tail curling protectively around itself, and the clutch of spotted brown eggs beneath its front feet. And then Fleur de Lacre began to dance. It wasn't the same rapid, provocative dancing as the Vila at the World Cup. This was graceful, slow, and hypnotic, almost like a ballet. The crowd fell silent, or maybe Violet just couldn't hear them anymore. So transfixed she was by the languid movements of Fleur's arms and legs, the dazzling tosses of her long, white-gold hair. The dragon, too, seemed mesmerized. The dance carried Fleur around the arena, moving to and fro around the dragon, drawing closer, but then pulling away again, tantalizingly out of reach. The dragon's head followed in time with her movements. The lids of its great yellow eyes were starting to droop, and its tail had uncoiled, now stretching lazily behind it. Still Fleur danced closer and closer, and the dragon's head dropped lower and lower until it was resting on the ground, fast asleep. Fleur stopped dancing abruptly, and time seemed to speed back up again. With a determined look on her beautiful face, Fleur tiptoed her way right up to the dragon's nest and reached for the golden egg. The Welsh Green let out a great snore, and a jet of red flame shot from its nostrils. Fleur dived just in time to avoid the full blast, but when she scrambled to her feet, the whole crowd could see the flames clinging to the fine material of her skirt, burning it away. Fleur patted frantically at her leg for a moment before aiming her wand. A jet of water shot out of it, drenching all down her side. A few laughs rang out from the crowd, Sirius among them. Now soaking wet, Fleur approached the sleeping dragon once more and gently lifted the golden egg out of its nest. The whistle sounded again. Champion and dragon were both led away, and it was time for the scores. Madame Maxime offered a 9, which got cheers only from the cluster of Beauxbaton students. Dumbledore and Crouch both gave Fleur 7 points. Bagman then gave her a 6, and so did Karkaroff. "I thought she did a bit better than that," Violet said, frowning even as she clapped politely. "That's still less than Cass got," said Tracy, not even bothering to hide her grin. He's in the lead. Next onto the field, entering the pit to thunderous applause, was Victor Crumb. Shoulders hunched and harsh features set into a look of steely determination. He didn't make quite the same impression as Fleur de Lacre had on Violet, but when he raised his wand and aimed a spell right at the dragon, no one could have said he wasn't just as interesting. The spell hit the dragon the Chinese fireball with its odd golden fringe right in the eye, and it let out a piercing, furious roar. Risky, but a good move, Sirius commented, leaning in to be heard over the noise. Conjunctivitis curse. The eyes are one of a dragon's only weak points. It's what I would have done. As soon as the dragon's gaze was no longer on him, Crumb darted forward with surprisingly agility. He easily dodged a swipe from the dragon's claws and raised his wand again, hitting the dragon's other eye with the same spell. The fireball must have been in agony. It reeled backward, tossing its great fringed head as Crumb maneuvered around its thrashing limbs. The dragon was so blinded and enraged that it didn't even seem to notice when its foot came down on two of its own orange, normal eggs, nearly crushing Crumb in the process. But a moment later, Golden Egg raised high in the air in victory. Victor Crumb emerged from beneath the dragon and the finishing whistle sounded. The crowd was going wild. The judges scored Crumb favorably. Despite the damage to the real eggs, he'd come away without a scratch, unlike Cassius and Fleur, and was the only one who had attacked their dragon directly. With 40 points, Victor Crumb was now in the lead. That took some of the wind out Tracy's sails. Violet, however, didn't have time to worry about the scoring system, because the enclosure gates had opened once more and 6 dragon handlers were leading the last dragon into the pit. The Hungarian horntail looked exactly as fierce and vicious as it had the other night, illuminated only by the flames billowing from its own mouth. Lean and sinewy, its black scales gleamed in the sunlight, as did the foot-long spikes that jutted from its long tail. It snapped angrily at its retreating handlers and immediately took up a protective stance over its clutch of granite-gray eggs. When the whistle blew and Harry stepped into the enclosure, Violet's vision narrowed to a thin tunnel, fixed solely on her twin brother. Harry looked so small compared to Crumb and the others. Small and thin and very scared as he should have been. The horntail was crouched low over her eggs, her wings half furled, her evil yellow eyes upon him, thrashing her spiked tail, leaving yard-long gouges in the hard ground. "Come on, Harry," she heard Sirius mutter beside her. Harry raised his wand. "Don't," Violet thought, panicked. "Don't attack it, please, please." "Akio, firebolt," he shouted. Was that it? What were he summoning his broomstick for? What good would a broomstick, made of very flammable things like wood and sticks, do against an angry, fire-breathing dragon? Harry had lost his mind, Violet decided. He'd snapped under the pressure. He must have seen the crowd all around him, the cheering and jeering faces, and mistaken the first task for a Quidditch match. Look at him, standing there, staring dumbly at them all. Did he even realize the danger he was in? Violet was halfway out of her seat when a flicker of movement over the stands caught her eye. The firebolt had come. It hurtled around the edge of the wood, soared down into the enclosure, and stopped dead midair beside Harry. Without a moment's hesitation, Harry swung his leg over the broom and kicked off. The crowd shrieked with awe and delight as Harry took off like a shot, rising high above the enclosure. High above them he hovered, and for a terrible moment Violet, though he meant to fly away from it all, leaving the dragon and Hogwarts and her behind in one fell swoop. But swoop was exactly what Harry did next. He dived, the horntail's head following him, and Violet screamed as a jet of flame shot toward her brother and engulfed the place where he'd just been. But Harry wasn't there anymore. She'd been so wrong to doubt him. Harry wasn't mad at all. He was a genius. "Great Scott, he can fly," yelled Bagman as the crowd shrieked and gasped. "Are you watching this, mister?" "Crumb!" Harry soared higher and higher in a circle. The horntail was still following his progress. Its head revolving on its long neck, he could make it dizzy. Send it toppling down that way. The horntail opened its mouth again, and Harry plummeted, avoiding the flames, but the tail came whipping up to meet him instead. Again, Violet screamed as one of the long spikes caught Harry in the shoulder, ripping his robes. But Harry barely flinched, even as the blood began to darken the fabric around the wound. Rather than taking any more risky dives, Harry took up a pattern of movement similar to what Fleur de Lacre had done. He began to fly, first this way, then the other, not near enough for the dragon to breath fire at him, but still close enough to pose a sufficient threat. He danced higher in the air, and the Hauntel's head rose with him, her neck now stretched to its fullest extent, still swaying like a snake before its charmer. Harry rose a few more feet, and the dragon let out a roar of exasperation. Violet realized what he was doing. The dragon was too protective of her eggs. He'd never be able to get close enough with the way she was guarding the nest, unless he got her to move. He was playing the fly, taunting the Hauntel to come and swat him. The dragon's tail thrashed again, but he was too high to reach now. She shot fire into the air, which Harry dodged with ease. Her jaws opened wide, and then she reared, spreading her great, black, leathery wings at last, as wide as those of a small airplane, and Harry dived. Violet let out a shriek of panic and excitement as Harry sped toward the ground as fast as he could go. Toward the now unprotected eggs by the dragon's clawed front legs he was a blur, and flash of speed and color, and then with a huge spurt of speed, he was back, soaring over the stands, the large golden egg tucked safely under his uninjured arm, and a big, silly grin on his windswept face. Violet, like the crowd around her, leapt to her feet to cheer, clapping her hands, stamping her feet, feeling a little faint, but very proud. The dragon keepers rushed out to subdue the Hauntel as Harry landed. Hagrid, Professor McGonagall, and Professor Moody were hurrying to meet him, all waving and smiling as well as they led him away to the medic's tent. He did it! Violet gasped, breathless, as she collapsed back into her seat. It's over, and he's not dead. He's not dead. Oh, I hope his shoulder's all right, said Tracy. It looked bad, but he didn't seem too bothered by it, did he? Sirius had already jumped to his feet. Come on, he said, taking Violet's hand and pulling her up as well. She barely had time to get her foot before Sirius pulled her off through the crowd, which parted quickly and easily before him. When they reached the tent that Harry had disappeared into, they found that they were not the first visitors to make it there. When the tent flap was pulled open, they were greeted by the sight of Harry, Ron, and Hermione in the middle of a great group hug. Sirius, with a bark of laughter, immediately stepped in and joined them. Well done, Harry, he said loudly, and laughed again at Harry's startled expression. Excellent technique. Flying like that, you could have given your father a run for his money. Harry, though grinning broadly, looked thunderstruck. He allowed himself to be led back out of the tent, Sirius' arms slung over one shoulder, while Ron stuck close to his other side, frantically recapping all the other contestants before him. The crowd was still cheering madly, and only increased in volume as the scores came in. An 8, 2 9s, a 10 from Bagman. A wall of cheers went up at that, and then an angry chorus from all sides when Karkaroff put up a 4. What? Ron bellowed furiously. 4. You lousy, biased scumbag, you gave Crumb 10. But Harry didn't seem to care. He had that jubilant, slightly vapid look of happiness on his face that Violet had only seen a handful of times in their short life. It was her very favorite look to see on him. Feeling wetness on her cheeks, she realized with a start that she was crying again. But she, too, didn't care. These, for once, were tears of joy.